If anyone on this plane has aviation experience, please, God, come forward now. The voice cracked over the intercom, raw, terrified, not a drill. And in seat 5A, a man covered in tattoos wearing a Hells Angels patch slowly closed his eyes because he knew exactly what that voice meant. He knew what was happening to this plane, and he knew with a certainty that felt like a fist closing around his chest that he was the only person on board who could stop it. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first thing Claire Morgan noticed about the man in seat 5A was the way he moved through the jetway. Not fast, not slow, deliberate, like a man who had learned a long time ago that the world would make space for him whether he asked for it or not. His boots were heavy and worn at the toe. His black leather vest carried the Hells Angels patch across the back, a death's head, bold and unapologetic. His arms were sleeved in tattoos from wrist to collar. His blonde hair, shot through with threads of silver, was tied back tight. His face looked like it had seen weather in every form, wind grief. Years of silence. Claire smiled at him the way she smiled at everyone. He didn't smile back. He just gave her a short nod, polite, contained, and moved to his seat without asking for anything. She noticed the way other passengers shifted when he passed. A woman in a beige cardigan pressed herself slightly into her husband's arm. A teenager in row 4 stared openly until his mother touched his elbow and turned his head forward. An older businessman in the aisle seat of row 3 actually pulled his laptop bag a few inches closer, like proximity to this man was some kind of risk. The man in seat 5A noticed all of it. He always did. He sat down, buckled his belt, and looked out the window at the tarmac of Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. The afternoon sun was hitting the concrete hard and flat, heat rising in slow waves. He pressed his temple lightly against the glass and let his eyes go half shut. His name was Ethan Walker. He was 42 years old. He had no checked luggage. He had a one-way ticket to Seattle that he'd bought with cash at the counter 40 minutes before boarding. He had a chapter meeting up north he wasn't sure he was going to attend. He had a sandwich he hadn't touched in the bag under the seat in front of him. He had a phone he'd put on airplane mode before he even reached the gate. And he had a past that he carried the way most men carry old shrapnel, deep, quiet, and impossible to remove. The woman who settled into seat 5B beside him was named Diane Kowalski, 61 years old, retired school teacher from Scottsdale. She was traveling to Seattle to visit her daughter and meet her first grandchild, a baby girl born 6 days ago. She had a photo on her phone, the baby's face red and wrinkled and perfect, that she had already looked at 47 times since yesterday. She was the kind of woman who made conversation with everyone. Checkout clerks, gas station attendants, people waiting for buses. She believed in it. She believed that most people were lonely in ways they couldn't name, and that a simple exchange of words was sometimes the only medicine available. She looked at the man beside her. He was staring out the window. She looked at the patch on his vest. She looked at the tattoo on the back of his left hand, an eagle wing spread talons forward. She looked away. She put her purse on her lap, folded her hands over it, and stared at the seat back pocket in front of her. She did not say hello. She didn't know why. She always said hello. She had made a personal rule of it 30 years ago after her own mother told her that the most common human regret was the conversation you never started. But something stopped her. Some deep-coded instinct that she would spend the rest of this flight quietly ashamed of. Ethan didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't care. He had long ago stopped expecting warmth from strangers on airplanes. He had long ago stopped expecting warmth from most places. The Hells Angels gave him brotherhood. The road gave him motion. Motion was the only thing that had ever come close to peace. 2 rows ahead in seat 3C, a man named Walter Hayes was watching. Walter was 73 years old. He had a white mustache trimmed with military precision and hands that still moved with the economy of someone who had spent decades operating machinery that didn't forgive mistakes. He was a retired Air Force pilot, 26 years of service, 2 combat deployments, and a distinguished flying cross he kept in a shoebox under his bed because he felt embarrassed having it anywhere visible. Flew commercial now, the way some men drove familiar roads out of habit, out of affection, out of the simple pleasure of being close to something he loved, even if he was only a passenger in it. He had noticed Ethan Walker the moment the man entered the jetway. Not because of the vest, not because of the tattoos, because of the way Ethan's eyes had moved when he stepped through the cabin door. Most passengers, when they board a plane, look for their row number. They look at the overhead bins. They look at the seatback screens. Their eyes are on the domestic, the immediate, the personal. Ethan's eyes had done something different. In the first 3 seconds inside the cabin, without appearing to try, he had scanned both emergency exit rows. He had glanced at the ceiling above the cockpit door. His nostrils had flared slightly, almost imperceptibly at a particular moment, like a man registering a scent that meant something to him. Walter had seen that before. He had seen it in himself, in his own reflection in airplane windows for years after retirement. The involuntary assessment, the way training rewires the brain so permanently that you never fully become a civilian again. The way certain men look at an aircraft not as transportation, but as a living system that either holds together or it doesn't. Walter said nothing. He opened his book, a worn paperback he had read at least 3 times, and kept Ethan Walker in the soft periphery of his attention. Flight 728 pushed back from the gate at 3:14 in the afternoon, 7 minutes behind schedule. Captain James Mercer, 54, was at the controls, a 20-year veteran with the airline, steady and methodical. The kind of pilot who pre-flighted everything twice and never rushed his checklists. Beside him, First Officer Daniel Brooks, 31, sharp and technically capable, 3 years on this route. The weather between Phoenix and Seattle was mostly clean, a front pushing in from the Pacific that would give them some turbulence over southern Oregon, but nothing that should complicate the flight. They were carrying 183 passengers and 6 crew. The takeoff roll was normal. The climb was normal. The crew went through their after-takeoff checklist with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this 1,000 times. At 35,000 feet, Captain Mercer leveled off and handed the autopilot the keys, so to speak. He told Daniel he was going to stretch his legs after they cleared the first checkpoint. He meant back cabin. He meant 5 minutes 10 at the outside. That was the last normal thing that happened on Flight 728. In the cabin, the flight had settled into the comfortable numbness of mid-cruise. The drink cart started its slow journey down the aisle. A child in row 16 was playing a game on a tablet with the volume up slightly too high. The businessman in row 3 was on his second gin and tonic. Diane Kowalski was looking at the photo of her granddaughter again. Ethan Walker had his eyes closed. I was not asleep. He was never fully asleep on aircraft. Some part of his brain, the part that had been trained and honed and burned into shape by 15 years of military aviation, stayed awake and listening, even when the rest of him went quiet. He could feel the vibration of the engines through the fuselage. He could feel the subtle shift in airframe tone that meant the autopilot was making corrections. He could feel through the soles of his boots the heartbeat of a machine doing exactly what it was supposed to do. It was the absence of that heartbeat when it came that woke him fully. Not a sound, not a jolt, just a change in frequency, a quality of vibration that shifted in a way that his body recognized before his conscious mind could name it. He opened his eyes, he looked at the wing, he watched it for 30 seconds. Then he looked at the overhead panel, then at the aisle, then at the cockpit door. Nothing visible, nothing the other passengers would notice. The cabin was calm, the drink cart was rattling along. The child with the tablet was still playing his game. But Ethan had heard something in the bones of this plane. Something small and wrong, like a single note played flat in the middle of a familiar song. Most people would never hear it. Most people weren't listening the way he listened. He sat up straighter, and then the cockpit door opened. One of the flight attendants, a young woman named Sarah, barely 25, came out with a face that was doing everything it could to stay composed. She found Claire Morgan at the drink cart and pulled her 2 steps aside. Claire's hand tightened on the cart handle. Sarah leaned in and said something very quietly. Claire turned and looked at the cockpit door. Her color changed. Ethan saw it. He saw the exact moment a trained professional's composure cracked at the hairline. He saw the way Claire straightened up and took a breath, the specific breath of someone who has just been handed something terrible and is deciding how to carry it. He unclipped his seatbelt, just slightly, just enough to move if he needed to. Claire moved through the cabin with controlled urgency. She was looking for someone. Her eyes were moving row by row, assessing, searching. She stopped at a man in row 8, a heavy-set man wearing a polo shirt with some kind of medical logo. She bent and asked him something quietly. He shook his head. She moved on. She stopped at a woman in row 11 who had a nursing badge clipped to her bag. The woman shook her head too. Wrong kind of help. Claire was looking for someone with aviation experience. Ethan knew that because it was the only thing that made sense. Whatever was happening up front, whatever had sent Sarah out of that cockpit with her face in pieces, it wasn't medical. It was mechanical or pilot-related, or both. He watched Claire work her way through the forward cabin. He watched her face get tighter with every shaking head, every apologetic shrug. He watched her reach the front of the aisle and stop and press her hand flat against the bulkhead like she needed something solid to hold. Then she picked up the intercom handset. Her voice came through the cabin speakers, steady, professional, and carrying the specific quality of a person who is fighting very hard not to let you hear how frightened she is. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your senior flight attendant. We apologize for interrupting. If there is anyone on board with aviation or aircraft systems experience, we'd ask that you please press your call button or come forward to speak with us. We'd appreciate your assistance. Thank you. The cabin went still. For a long, heavy moment, nobody moved. The businessman in row 3 looked around. The woman in the beige cardigan looked at her husband. The child with the tablet looked up. Ethan sat with his hands on his thighs and his eyes straight ahead. His jaw was tight, his breathing was slow. I was doing the calculation that he had been trying not to do for the last 4 minutes. The one that told him with cold mathematical certainty that he was the most qualified person on this plane. That whatever was happening in that cockpit, his 15 years of military aviation rescue, emergency procedures, systems failures, controlled crash landings, catastrophic engine events, made him the closest thing to a solution that these 183 people had. He knew it, and he didn't want to know it, because the last time he had been the most qualified person in an emergency, he had made a decision. A fast decision. A decision that the manual said was correct. A decision that he had run through 100,000 times since in every quiet moment in sleepless midnight. And his closest friend, Ryan Cooper, had not come home. Ryan had a daughter. She was 3 when he died. Ethan still knew her age because he still counted. She was 17 now. He had never contacted her. He didn't think he deserved to. He pressed his palms flat against his thighs. He was not going to stand up. He was not that man anymore. He was a biker. He was a brother. He was someone who rode and worked and kept his hands clean of the sky because the sky had already taken everything it was going to take from him. He pressed harder. From seat 3C, Walter Hayes was watching him. Walter had seen the calculation happening in Ethan's face the way you can see a man wrestling with something in a dream. All the motion internal, all the evidence, external, subtle, and unmistakable, if you knew what to look for. He saw Ethan's jaw. He saw Ethan's hands. He saw the way Ethan's eyes had gone to the wing and stayed there. Walter had served with men like this. Men who were made for a specific thing, trained for it, shaped by it, and then broke against it and tried to walk away, and found that walking away was not the same as leaving. Because some things follow, because some things are not chapters you can close. He turned in his seat. He was 3 rows ahead, too far to whisper. But Ethan was watching the cockpit door, and Walter turned enough that their eyes could potentially meet. Ethan looked at him. Walter held his gaze for a moment. Then he said quietly enough that only Ethan could possibly hear, "You can take off the jacket, son, but you can't take out what's in you." Ethan looked away. Walter turned back around. 30 seconds later, the plane dropped. Not a bump, not the kind of turbulence that makes drinks slosh and overhead bins rattle in their latches. This was a loss of lift, a sudden, sickeningly clean descent, the feeling of the floor falling away. The feeling that gravity had remembered something it had briefly forgotten. It lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds is nothing. 4 seconds is the length of an exhale. But in a pressurized metal tube at 35,000 feet, 4 seconds of unexpected freefall is enough to turn every rational human thought into pure animal fear. The cabin exploded. Screaming, the kind that comes before you decide to scream, involuntary, reflexive, stripped of dignity by sheer terror. People grabbing armrests, grabbing each other, grabbing anything fixed and solid. The child with the tablet threw it. It hit the seat back in front of him and clattered into the aisle. A drink cup came off a tray table and went sideways. A woman in row 9 grabbed the arm of the complete stranger sitting next to her and held on with both hands. Then the plane leveled. Not smoothly, lurching like a car catching its wheels at the edge of something, but level. The screaming tapered into sobbing, into fast, ragged breathing, into the sound of people talking to each other in the voice people use when they're trying to convince themselves they're okay. Diane Kowalski had grabbed Ethan's arm. She hadn't meant to. She hadn't decided to. Her hand had simply found the nearest solid thing and locked on. Now she looked at it, her hand white-knuckled around his tattooed forearm, and started to pull it back, flushing with embarrassment. "Don't apologize," Ethan said. His voice was even. Not calm in the way of someone who wasn't scared. Calm in the way of someone who had made a decision about what to do with their fear a long time ago and never unmade it. She looked at his face. His eyes were already on the cockpit door. "That wasn't turbulence," she said. She didn't know why she said it. She didn't know what made her certain. But something in the quality of that drop, something in the way the plane had felt suddenly incomplete, had reached past her 71 years of civilian life and left her with a knowledge she didn't have a language for. "No," Ethan said quietly, "it wasn't." The intercom crackled. Claire's voice came through again, and this time, the composure was thinner. Still there, but thinner. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. We are experiencing some technical difficulties. We ask that you remain calm. If there is anyone on board with flight experience or aircraft systems training, please press your call button immediately. I repeat, flight experience or aircraft systems training. Please press your call button now." Silence. 12 seconds of silence that felt like standing at the edge of something. Then from seat 3C, Walter Hayes pressed his call button. And from seat 5A, Ethan Walker stood up. He moved through the cabin the way you move through a place when you've stopped being a passenger in it. Not pushing, not running, just walking with a kind of purposeful economy that parted people the way water parts around something that knows where it's going. He heard things as he passed. A man in a middle seat asking his wife if they should do something. A teenager saying, "Oh my God," over and over like a prayer or a panic attack or both. An older gentleman near the window, hands folded. Eyes closed, lips moving, not praying, Ethan realized. Counting. Doing something measured and intentional with his breath. He reached the front galley. Claire turned to face him. For a half second, her eyes went to the vest, to the patch, to the tattoos, to every visual detail that had nothing to do with what was happening and everything to do with what she had been taught without anyone ever explicitly teaching her to trust or not trust at first sight. Then she looked at his eyes, and she made a decision. "What's happening up there?" Ethan said. She didn't waste time. "Captain collapsed. We think cardiac event. First Officer Brooks has control, but one engine. We had an engine irregularity about 6 minutes ago. Systems are reading abnormal, and he's managing it, but there's something wrong with the fuel readings, and he doesn't know." She stopped, took a breath. "He said he's never seen this pattern before. Is he instrument audited for single engine approach?" She blinked. I think so, but does he know his destination weather?" "Seattle is reporting crosswinds and rain. What's the nearest divert?" He was looking at Portland or Eugene. "Eugene is better, shorter approach, less traffic, wider runway." Ethan was already moving. "Open the door." "I need to know who you are." He looked at her. "I'm the person who just told you Eugene is better. Open the door." Claire opened the door. Daniel Brooks was 21,000 hours of training and 3 years of line flying, and one very bad afternoon away from a complete collapse of composure. He was holding it together the way you hold a cracked thing together carefully without applying any more pressure than absolutely necessary, because you know that one wrong move is the move that breaks it apart entirely. He heard the cockpit door open and he turned, expecting Claire. He saw Ethan Walker. He saw the vest, the tattoos, the long hair. "Who the hell?" he started. "My name is Ethan Walker. I spent 15 years as a military aviation rescue specialist. I flew emergency recovery missions in combat conditions with compromised aircraft. I know what that fuel reading pattern means, and I know it's going to get worse in about 8 minutes. Tell me what you've got." Daniel stared at him. Tell me what you've got, Ethan said again, not louder, but with a weight that filled the space between them, Daniel told him. The captain had gone down fast, no warning signs, nothing, and Daniel had taken control without any transition period. That alone was manageable. What was not manageable was the cascade that had started while Captain Mercer was still technically flying. A fuel pressure anomaly in Engine 2. Daniel had run the procedure, and the readings had stabilized, and he had thought it was over. Then the plane had dropped that sudden loss of lift, and now the readings were climbing again, but wrong. Not the way they climbed when a system recovered. The way they climbed when something was fighting itself. Ethan looked at the instruments for 11 seconds. Your fuel is contaminated, he said. Not all of it, a percentage. Enough to cause combustion inconsistency in Engine 2. The engine is running, but it's running rough, and every cycle is adding stress to a component that is probably already compromised from the contamination. Daniel's voice dropped. How long do we have? Depends on how much contaminated fuel is in the line. Could be 12 minutes. Could be 40. Ethan sat down in the captain's seat. His hands moved across the panel with the ease of a man who had sat in this position before. Not in this aircraft, not this exact configuration, but close enough that his hands remembered. We're not going to wait to find out. We're diverting to Eugene. How's your crosswind training? I'm current. How's your actual crosswind experience? The pause. Limited. That's fine. I got enough for both of us. You fly. I'll call it. Daniel looked at him, at this stranger in a leather vest who had walked through a door 90 seconds ago and was now telling him how to save his airplane. You're going to have to trust me, Ethan said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of the situation. Daniel looked at the instruments. He looked at the seat beside him, at the man whose hands were resting on the secondary controls with a steadiness that Daniel right now in this moment did not have in himself. Okay, Daniel said. Ethan picked up the radio. Eugene approach. This is Flight 728 declaring emergency. We are single engine contingency, possible fuel contamination. One pilot incapacitated. Requesting immediate clearance for priority approach. We have 183 souls on board. The response came back in seconds. Eugene approach, calm and immediate. Flight 728, you are cleared for priority, approach runway 16. Emergency services are being notified. Altimeter 299er5. Advise when ready for vectors. Flight 728, we are ready for vectors, Ethan said. He put down the handset and looked at Daniel. Okay, first officer, let's bring your people home. Moim. In the cabin, nobody knew what was happening behind the cockpit door. They knew the plane had dropped. They knew the intercom had asked for someone with flight experience. They knew a man in a Hell's Angels vest had walked to the front of the cabin and spoken to the flight attendant and disappeared through a door that no passenger was supposed to go through. They had opinions about this. A retired surgeon in row 7 told his wife that the biker was probably a problem, not a solution. The businessman in row 3 on his 3rd gin and tonic now, because he had decided that the drink cart was still running, and running the drink cart was someone's way of signaling normalcy, said to no one in particular that this was completely insane. A young mother in row 14 had her arm around her 8-year-old and her eyes on the front of the cabin and her lips together in a line so tight her husband kept touching her shoulder and she kept not responding. Diane Kowalski sat in seat 5B and looked at the empty seat beside her. She was thinking about the tattoo on the back of Ethan's left hand, the eagle with its wings spread and its talons forward. She was thinking about the way he had said that wasn't turbulence, without any drama in it, just the flat, certain delivery of someone who already knew the answer and was only confirming what you'd asked. She was thinking about the way he had walked to the front of the cabin, like he'd done it before, like there was somewhere he knew how to go. Walter Hayes in seat 3C had pressed his call button and been met by Sarah, the young flight attendant, who had told him quietly that someone had already come forward. Walter had asked if it was the man from 5A. Sarah had hesitated, which was answer enough. Walter had nodded and said, "Good," and released his call button and gone back to his book. He wasn't really reading, he was listening to the engines. I was listening for the quality of the vibration that he knew from 26 years of flying would tell him what was happening before any instrument could. And for the first time since the drop, he let himself believe that they might be all right. Because he had watched Ethan Walker's eyes move across that cabin, and he had recognized what was in them. Not recklessness, not ego, not the dangerous confidence of someone who had never lost anything. The other kind. The kind that comes after loss. The kind that knows exactly what failure costs and chooses to stand up anyway. Engine 2 gave its second warning 13 minutes into the approach. Ethan felt it before the instruments confirmed it, a change in the vibration, a roughness in the way the aircraft was sitting in the air, as though something that had been compensating was now refusing to compensate anymore. He scanned the panel fast, called out the changes to Daniel, and began walking him through the contingency. "We're not shutting it down yet," Ethan said. "It's still producing partial thrust and we need it for the approach. But we're treating it as unreliable. Stay off the throttle on 2 unless I call for it." "Understood. When we get to final, the crosswind is going to want to push us left. Don't fight it too early. Let it drift until 500 feet, then correct." 500. "I know it feels late, it's not. If you correct too early, you're going to overshoot and we won't have the runway length to recover." Daniel's hands were tight on the controls. "Daniel." Ethan's voice was quiet, direct, the kind of voice that doesn't leave room for the fear to expand. "You've trained for exactly this. I'm going to be here for every foot of this approach. You are not doing this alone. Do you understand?" Daniel breathed. "I understand." "Then let's fly." The approach into Eugene, Oregon began through rain and building cloud. The runway appeared in the windscreen gray and rain-soaked, and exactly where it was supposed to be. The approach lights burning orange through the weather like something that had been waiting specifically for them. In the cabin, the passengers felt the descent. Some of them understood it wasn't normal. The angle was different. The engine sound was different. The speed of the approach felt slightly off in the way that things feel off when you have flown enough times that your body has learned the ordinary and can recognize the deviation from it. The young mother in row 14 pressed her son's head against her shoulder. The businessman in row 3 gripped his armrest and looked at his drink and put it down. Diane Kowalski pressed her palms together in her lap and looked at Summit 5A and whispered something very quietly that was not quite a prayer but was close enough. Walter Hayes put his book away. He watched the wing. He watched the engine cowling. He watched the rain streaking across the glass. He had done this before, sat in a seat that wasn't the pilot's seat, and trusted someone at the front of the aircraft to do what needed to be done. It never got easier. It never got less terrifying. You just learned over time that trust was not the same as certainty, and that sometimes trust was the bravest thing available. He trusted the man in seat 5A. I didn't know his whole story. He didn't need to. He had seen enough in that first moment in the jetway to know the shape of what Ethan Walker was. Some things you recognize. At 400 feet, Engine 2 gave its final warning. The aircraft yawed, not violently but enough. A lurch to the right, a loss of symmetry that Daniel felt in his hands and reacted to before Ethan could call it. "Don't overcorrect," Ethan said. "I've got it." "Easy, easy." The runway was right there. The centerline markers were visible through the rain. 300 feet. 250. "Left rudder gentle," Ethan said. "Left rudder. You've got the center line. Don't look at the sides. Look at where you're going." 200 feet. "Flare point at 50, Ethan said. "I'll call it." 100 feet. "Throttle 2 to idle," Ethan said. "Now." Daniel pulled it. The aircraft settled. 70 feet, 50 feet. "Flare," Ethan said. The nose came up. The wheels touched hard, uneven the left. Main first, a jolt that went through the airframe and into every person in the cabin, like a single struck note, and then the right main, and then the nose wheel grinding, and firm and real against wet concrete. Thrust reversers. Brakes. The aircraft decelerating, the runway markers strobing past emergency vehicles visible at the sides with their lights going. And then they were stopped. The aircraft was stopped. The engines were winding down. In the cabin, there was a half second of absolute silence. The silence of people realizing that what they had just survived was real, that the worst hadn't happened, that they were on the ground. And then the sound, a sound that started as exhale and became something else, a release, a cry, an applause that wasn't really applause yet, but was the sound that comes before it, the sound of bodies understanding that they're alive. The young mother burst into tears. Her son didn't cry. He was 8 years old and he put his arm around her instead. And that image, that child comforting his mother in the aftermath of fear, would stay with several people on that plane for the rest of their lives. Diane Kowalski sat very still for a long moment. Then she looked at seat 5A. It was still empty. He was still up front. She thought about all the ways she had avoided saying hello to him, all the half-conscious calculations that her brain had run in the 30 seconds before she decided without fully deciding to say nothing. The vest, the tattoos, the way he didn't smile, all the things she had used to build a wall between herself and a man she didn't know. The man who was right now on the other side of a door she couldn't see through, having done something she couldn't fully comprehend. She looked at her hands. She looked at the photo of her granddaughter on her phone. She thought about how close she had come to never seeing that baby's face in anything other than a photograph. And she started to cry, quietly, without drama. The way people cry when they are finally honest with themselves about something they should have known all along. Walter Hayes reached over from his aisle seat and touched the arm of the man sitting beside him. A stranger, a heavy-set guy who had gripped his armrest since the drop and hadn't let go. "We're all right," Walter said. "We're all right." The man looked at him. "Who was that?" he asked. His voice was unsteady. "That guy who went up there. Who was he?" Walter looked toward the cockpit door. "I don't know his whole story," Walter said, "but I know what kind of man he is." The cockpit door opened, and Ethan Walker walked back into the cabin. He looked tired, not exhausted, not broken, but the specific kind of tired that comes after you have spent a concentrated period of time holding something together that wanted very much to fall apart. His face was composed. His hands were at his sides. He walked the way he always walked, deliberate, unhurried, not performing anything. The cabin had gone almost completely quiet when the door opened. Now as he moved down the aisle, something started. It started in row 3 where Walter Hayes turned in his seat and began to clap. Then the young mother. Then the heavy-set man. Then the businessman who set down his empty cup and clapped with both hands. Then the teenager in row 4 who had stared at Ethan when he boarded and now looked at him with an expression no 16-year-old usually has, something older, something that would stay with him. By the time Ethan reached row 5, the entire cabin was clapping. He stopped. He looked at the people around him, these strangers who had moved away from him in the jetway, who had pulled their bags closer, who had looked through him or around him or away from him, looking at him now, with something in their faces that he had not expected and was not entirely sure how to receive. He didn't say anything grand. He didn't say anything rehearsed. He looked at Diane Kowalski, who was crying in seat 5B, and he said quietly enough that only she could hear, "Your granddaughter is waiting for you." She couldn't speak. She just nodded. And Ethan Walker sat back down in seat 5A, closed his eyes, and let the sound of the living wash over him. The emergency vehicles reached the aircraft before the doors were fully open. Paramedics, fire crews, airport authority, personnel, all of it, converging on Flight 728 with the organized urgency of people who had trained for exactly this and hoped they would never need to use it. The jetway extended. The forward door came open. The first paramedic team went straight for the cockpit where Captain James Mercer was being kept stable by Claire, who had spent the entire approach holding his airway and monitoring his pulse and talking to him in a low, even voice, even though he couldn't respond, because she had always believed that people in crisis could still hear you and that the sound of a calm human voice was its own kind of medicine. They got him off the plane on a stretcher. His color was bad. His pulse was irregular. But he was alive, and the paramedic who came out of the cockpit first gave Claire a single nod that meant, for now at least, that it was going to stay that way. Daniel Brooks sat in the left seat for a long time after they took the captain out. I didn't move. He didn't speak. He sat with his hands in his lap and stared at the instrument panel that had told him things he'd never seen before, and his mind kept running the approach on a loop, the yaw, the crosswind, the moment engine 2 gave its final warning, and the runway was right there. And the voice beside him was steady and certain, and everything that he in that moment was not. Ethan stood in the cockpit doorway. "Brooks," Daniel looked up. "You flew that approach," Ethan said. "Not me. You had the controls. You felt the yaw, and you corrected before I called it. You need to understand that." Daniel shook his head. "I wouldn't have known the fuel contamination pattern. I wouldn't have called Eugene. I wouldn't have known the 500-foot correction. You would have figured it out." "I don't know that." "I do," Ethan said, "because you didn't freeze. Every time things got worse, you got quieter. That's not training. That's character. Training can tell you what to do. It can't tell you who to be when it matters. Daniel looked at him. "Get off the airplane," Ethan said not unkindly. "Go call someone who loves you. That's an order." Daniel almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely a movement, but it was there. He stood up. He extended his hand. Ethan shook it. The Eugene Springfield Airport was not built for situations like this. It was a regional airport, functional, efficient, modest. It handled turboprops and regional jets and the occasional charter. It did not handle 183 passenger diverted airliners with incapacitated captains. Potential fuel contamination in a passenger manifest that was now rapidly becoming a logistical and media event of a size the airport manager, a careful, organized woman named Roberta Chin, had never personally managed. She was doing her best. Buses had been arranged to take passengers to a nearby hotel. The airline had representatives on the phone and within an hour on the ground. The NTSB had been notified, which meant investigators would be arriving and nobody was going anywhere until statements had been taken. The contaminated aircraft had been moved to an isolated section of the apron and marked with yellow barriers. Fuel samples were already being collected, and somewhere in the middle of all this organized chaos, Ethan Walker had simply walked off the plane, found a wall in the corner of the terminal gate area, put his back against it and stood there. Not hiding, not moving, just standing, watching the process unfold with the detached patience of a man who had been in enough post-incident environments to know that the machine would eventually come for him and there was no point running from it. People noticed him. Of course they did. Passengers from Flight 728 kept looking over. Some of them, the ones who had been clapping 10 minutes ago in the cabin, made eye contact and looked away when he held theirs. The proximity of gratitude was easier at altitude. Down here on solid ground, with the adrenaline metabolizing and ordinary life reassembling itself around them, looking at Ethan Walker required them to see something about themselves that most people would rather leave unexamined. He understood. He didn't hold it against any of them. A little girl broke ranks. She was maybe 5 years old. She had been in row 16 with her parents. Ethan had registered her on boarding the way he registered everything without deciding to, and she had a stuffed rabbit held by one ear and the specific fearless directness of small children who have not yet learned to preemptively decide what they're allowed to approach. She walked right up to him. She looked at the Hells Angels patch. She looked at the tattoos. She looked up at his face. "Are you the one who drove the airplane?" she asked. Ethan looked down at her. "I helped," he said. She considered this seriously. "My daddy said you saved everybody." "Your daddy helped," Ethan said. "He kept you calm. That matters." She thought about this for a moment. Then she held out her rabbit, just held it out, offered it. He looked at the rabbit, then at her. "I think you need that more than I do," he said. "You can borrow it," she said, "for if you get scared." Something moved in Ethan Walker's face that he hadn't planned on. Something that started behind his eyes and worked its way forward before he could stop it. He crouched down to her level. He looked at the rabbit. He very carefully, very gently touched one of its worn ears. "Thank you," he said. His voice was even, but only just. Her mother appeared, rushed, apologetic hand, reaching for the girl's shoulder. "Lily, sweetheart, you can't just—" She stopped. She looked at Ethan. Her face ran through several things quickly. Then she said, "I'm sorry, she's perfect," Ethan said quietly. He stood back up. The mother looked at him for a moment longer than she meant to. Then she said, not loudly, not performatively, just honestly, "Thank you for what you did." Ethan nodded once. She pulled Lily gently back toward where her husband was waiting, and Lily looked back over her shoulder at Ethan with the calm, ancient eyes of children who understand more than they're supposed to. The NTSB investigator who found Ethan was named Marcus Webb. 47 compact, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of face that gave nothing away and recorded everything. He had a recorder and a notepad in the specific energy of someone who was very good at their job and had long since stopped being impressed by extraordinary things because extraordinary things were in his line of work simply the category of event that generated the paperwork he processed. He found Ethan at the wall. "Mr. Walker." Not a question. He already knew who he was. "Yeah, I'm Marcus Webb, NTSB. I'd like to take your statement." "I figured." Webb opened his notepad. "Walk me through what happened from your perspective. Start with when you first noticed something was wrong." Ethan told him. All of it. The frequency change and the vibration. Claire's face, the intercom call, the contamination pattern in the instruments, the Eugene call, the approach. He told it the way he had been trained to tell incident reports, flat, factual, sequential, without editorial. Webb wrote steadily and asked clean, precise questions and did not editorialize either. When Ethan finished, Webb was quiet for a moment. You identified fuel contamination from instrument readings in approximately 11 seconds, he said. I've seen that pattern before. In what context? Military. We had a contaminated batch on a base supply chain about 12 years ago. 2 aircraft went down before we figured out what we were looking at. After that, you learned to recognize it fast. Webb wrote something down. Then he looked up. Mr. Walker, do you have any idea why the contamination was in that aircraft's fuel supply? Ethan looked at him. That's your job. It is, Webb agreed, but I'm asking if you noticed anything at all that suggested this wasn't random. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He thought about what he had seen in those instruments. The specific distribution of the contamination, the way it had affected engine 2 and not engine 1, which should not have happened if the contamination was in the main supply, because both engines drew from the same source. Both engines should have been affected equally, Ethan said. Webb's pen stopped. If it was a general supply contamination, Ethan continued, engine 1 should have shown the same irregularity as engine 2. It didn't, which means that contamination was localized to engine 2's fuel line, which means it didn't come from the standard supply process. Webb looked at him for a long time. That's consistent with what our initial samples are showing, he said carefully. Then you're not looking at a supply chain problem, Ethan said. You're looking at something targeted. The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Webb wrote for a long time without looking up. That was the first twist that changed everything about Flight 7228. Not an accident, not a maintenance failure, something targeted. Webb closed his notepad. He thanked Ethan for his time with the professional courtesy of a man who was already thinking about 17 things simultaneously and would continue to think about them without pause until he had answers. He gave Ethan a card. He said they might need to follow up. He walked away without looking back. Ethan stood at the wall and felt the weight of what he had just said settle into him. He had told himself on the plane that once they were on the ground it was over, that he had done what needed doing and could walk back out of the sky and into the life he had built. The road, the chapter, the small contained existence that asked nothing of him except loyalty and presence. But targeted meant someone had done this on purpose. Targeted meant there were 183 people who had been on that plane for a reason that had nothing to do with going from Phoenix to Seattle. Targeted meant this was not finished. Daniel Brooks found him 20 minutes later. He had changed out of his uniform shirt and was wearing a plain white undershirt and the look of a man who had aged 3 years in the last 90 minutes. He had a cup of coffee from somewhere the airport had arranged catering for the stranded passengers, and he handed a second cup to Ethan without asking. Ethan took it. They stood together at the wall for a moment without speaking. NTSB talked to you? Ethan asked. For about 40 minutes, Daniel said. They're good. Webb is thorough. He asked me a lot of questions about the fuel load, the specific readings, the sequence. Daniel paused. He asked me if I'd noticed anything unusual about the pre-flight. Had you? No, but I've been going back through it in my head since he asked, and there was one thing the fueling crew was different from the usual. I noticed it because one of them was someone I hadn't seen before, and he was the one who handled the engine 2 supply port. I didn't think anything of it at the time because it's not unusual to have different crews. And I wasn't paying that kind of attention. He stopped. I should have been. You're not trained to suspect your ground crew, Ethan said. No, but you would have been. Ethan looked at his coffee. You don't know that. You noticed the frequency change in the vibration before the instruments confirmed anything, Daniel said. You looked at those readings for 11 seconds and called fuel contamination. You identified that it was localized before the NTSB even had their samples back. He shook his head. You're still whatever you were before you became whatever you are now. Ethan said nothing. Can I ask you something? Daniel said. You can ask. What happened that made you walk away from it? The questions sat in the air between them. Ethan looked at the far end of the terminal. He looked at the passengers from Flight 728 collecting their bags from a cart that had been brought in from the aircraft. He looked at Lily's father lifting her onto his shoulders and Lily's rabbit bouncing against his neck. and Lily's face calm, certain above the crowd, as though altitude was simply where she belonged. I made a decision, Ethan said. Good decision by the manual. By every standard I was trained against. And my partner didn't come home. What was his name? Ethan looked at him sharply. Nobody asked that. Not directly, not the counselors, not the debriefers, not the men in his chapter who knew the rough outline but never the specifics. Ryan, he said, the name felt strange in his mouth. Present, like saying it in a quiet room. Was he a pilot? Rescue specialist, same as me, better than me, honestly, in about 6 different ways. He had this ability to read a situation, the whole thing at once, like a chess player. He'd be telling me what was going to happen 30 seconds before it did. Ethan paused. The day he died, he was where I told him to be. He was following my call. Daniel was quiet. The manual said it was the right call, Ethan said. The debrief confirmed it. The report confirmed it. Every person who looked at it confirmed it. And none of that, he stopped. None of that made it feel true, Daniel said. Ethan looked at him. I lost my instructor, Daniel said quietly. Training accident 2 years before I got my commercial certificate. He was showing me a maneuver. Something went wrong with the aircraft maintenance issue, nobody's fault, or everybody's depending on how you look at it. I walked away. He didn't. He looked at his coffee. I know I couldn't have done anything, I know that. I still check the maintenance logs twice on every pre-flight. I still look at the fuel truck. I didn't look carefully enough today, and stop, Ethan said. Daniel looked at him. You checked what you were trained to check, Ethan said. If this was intentional, and I think it was whoever did it, knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what you would and wouldn't look for. You can't out-suspect a person who's been planning longer than your pre-flight takes. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said he'd have liked you, my instructor. He was ex-Air Force, hated people who performed being confident, loved people who just were. Ethan looked at him. I'm just saying, Daniel said, thank you, and not just for the plane. Walter Hayes appeared at Ethan's elbow at some point that Ethan could not have precisely identified one of those arrivals that seem in retrospect to have been inevitable. He had a sandwich in one hand and the kind of posture that came from decades of standing at attention and then deciding in retirement that the dignity could be maintained without the rigidity. They've got food over there, Walter said, holding up the sandwich. It's not good, but it's fuel. I'm fine. You haven't eaten since Phoenix. Walter said it as a statement, not a question. Ethan looked at him. You've been watching me a long time, old man. Since the jetway, Walter said without apology. I spotted you the moment you stepped onto the aircraft. The vest. The eyes, Walter corrected. The way you scanned the exits in the first 3 seconds. The way you registered the ceiling panel. He paused. Military aviation rescue, 15 years. Walter nodded slowly. I flew F-4s in the first deployment. Transitioned to transport command later, 26 years total. He looked at Ethan. I recognized what you were the moment I saw you. I couldn't tell you what chapter that vest represents. And I couldn't tell you the first thing about the life you've been living since you left. But I could tell you that the man inside that jacket never left the skip. You said that on the plane, but it needed saying again, apparently. Ethan almost smiled. You did something hard today, Walter said. His voice shifted still, even still composed, but carrying something underneath it that wasn't commentary. It was recognition, the specific recognition that passes between people who have been inside the same kind of experience and come out carrying the same kind of weight. Not the flying. Any qualified pilot could have assisted with the flying. I mean, you stood up. When everything in you was saying, sit down, stay hidden. That's not your life anymore, you stood up. Ethan was quiet. That's the hardest thing there is, Walter said. Harder than the approach, harder than the crosswind, harder than the contamination call. He paused. And you did it because of the people behind you, not because of anything you'd get from it. I've been around long enough to know the difference. I almost didn't stand up, Ethan said. I know, I was watching. Walter took a bite of his sandwich, chewed it thoughtfully. Almost is the most important word in most stories I find. Diane Kowalski came to find him before the buses left for the hotel. She had been crying, the evidence was still there, in the particular way her eyes looked, but she had regrouped in the way of women who have spent decades holding things together and know how to do it, even when holding is the last thing they feel like doing. She stood in front of him. She had clearly prepared something to say. He could see it in her posture. She'd been forming the words for a while. But now that she was standing here looking at him, the prepared things seemed to be insufficient, and she was having to reach for something else. I didn't say hello to you, she said. Ethan waited. On the plane, when you sat down, I always say hello to people. I have a rule about it. My mother told me the saddest regret a person can have is the conversation they didn't start, and I believed her, and I've lived by it for 30 years. She pressed her lips together. And then you sat down, and I looked at you, and I didn't say hello, and I've been sitting with that since we landed. It's all right, Ethan said. It's not, she said simply. I judged you before you opened your mouth. I didn't even judge you consciously. That's what bothers me most, I think. It wasn't a decision, it was automatic. And that automatic thing almost meant I never... She stopped, collected herself. I'm going to Seattle to meet my first grandchild. She was born 6 days ago. Her name is Eva. That's a good name? It is. She looked at him steadily. Because of what you did today, I'm going to hold her. I'm going to be there for all the days she's going to have. And I wanted to tell you that, and I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry for a reflex that I have to work on. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Tell Eva her grandmother is brave, he said. Braver than she gives herself credit for. Diane's composure wavered. She steadied it. She reached out and took his hand, both of hers around one of his briefly firmly, and then she released it and turned and walked toward the buses with the purposeful stride of someone who knows where they're going. Ethan watched her go. The investigative shift happened quietly the way the significant things usually do. Marcus Webb came back. He found Ethan still at the wall, and his face had changed in a way that was small but specific, the change that comes over a careful, controlled person when something has confirmed what they suspected and the confirmation is worse than the suspicion. Mr. Walker, he said, the fuel sample analysis is back. Preliminary but definitive enough. What was in Engine 2's supply line was not contamination from the storage tank. It was introduced at the aircraft level after fueling is complete. Ethan said nothing. He'd already told himself this was coming. The fueling crew log shows a discrepancy, Webb continued. One individual accessed the Engine 2 supply port who was not listed on the authorized crew manifest for this aircraft. He was wearing a legitimate uniform and badge, but the badge number traces to an employee who called in sick this morning. The silence between them was full. This was deliberate, Ethan said. That is the working theory, yes. Do you know who was on that passenger manifest, Ethan said. Do you know if anyone on that plane was a specific target? Webb looked at him. That's what we're trying to determine. The FBI has been notified and is taking a point on the criminal investigation. The NTSB is handling the technical side. He paused. You identified this aircraft-level contamination in 11 seconds. You know what this looks like from the inside. He said it carefully, deliberately. If you were advising on who on that flight someone would want to hurt, where would you start looking? Ethan thought about the cabin. 183 people. Businessmen, retirees' families, a retired school teacher going to meet her grandchild, a biker going to a meeting he wasn't sure he'd attend. Look at who books a seat on a specific flight versus who has to be on that flight, Ethan said. Well, if you're trying to hit a target on an airplane, you don't just destroy a plane at random. That's too uncertain, too variable, too many things that can go wrong, like a biker with aviation experience ending up in seat 5A. He paused. You pick a flight because someone specific is on it, someone who had to be on this route on this day in this window. Find who had no flexibility in their travel, and you'll find who you're looking for. Webb was writing, and the man who accessed the fuel port, Ethan said, he didn't do this alone. That level of access, that level of planning, the badge, the uniform, the specific port, the quantity that would cause engine failure at altitude but not on the ground, this is someone who knows aircraft systems. Not a technician doing a favor. Someone trained. Webb looked up. You should be consulting with the FBI, he said. I'm a biker with a one-way ticket to Seattle, Ethan said. You're a former military aviation rescue specialist who just identified a deliberate act of aircraft sabotage before our lab confirmed it. Webb said, those are not the same thing. Ethan said nothing. The FBI is going to want to talk to you, Webb said. Not for your statement, for your insight. Tell them I'm at the hotel with everyone else. Webb nodded. He started to go, then he stopped. Mr. Walker, for what it's worth, what you did up there today, that approach under those conditions with an incapacitated captain and a compromised first officer in a contaminated engine. He paused. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and the pause was the evidence of that. There are very few people on this earth who could have done that. He walked away. Ethan stood at the wall. He thought about Ryan Cooper. I thought about what Ryan would say right now if Ryan were standing beside him, which was something Ethan's brain did with a frequency he had never been able to reduce no matter how many miles of road he put between himself and the sky. He thought about Ryan's specific ability to read a situation in its entirety, chess player vision, seeing 30 seconds ahead. He wondered what Ryan would see 30 seconds ahead right now. He wondered who on Flight 728 was the reason it almost didn't land. The buses to the hotel were loading. Ethan watched the passengers from Flight 728 file out, all these people who had been strangers to each other 3 hours ago, who had sat in their separate rows with their separate lives and their separate fears, and who were now connected by something they would carry with them in ways they couldn't yet measure. He saw the businessman who'd been on his third gin and tonic now helping an older man with his bag. He saw the surgeon from row 7, who had told his wife the biker was a problem, holding a door open and nodding at people as they passed with the deliberate courtesy of a man trying to demonstrate that he was rethinking something about himself without having to say it out loud. He saw Lily on her father's shoulders, rabbit in hand, looking around the terminal with the wide-eyed appreciation of a child who found everything equally interesting. She spotted Ethan and waved, one big whole-arm wave, the way children wave when they haven't yet learned to be economical about enthusiasm. He raised one hand, she waved again, and then her father carried her out through the doors and into the evening. Walter Hayes stopped beside him on his way to the bus. "Coming?" Walter asked. "In a minute." Walter looked at him. He looked at the expression on Ethan's face, the particular quality of a man whose mind was working on something it couldn't put down. "What are you thinking about?" Walter asked. "Someone put that contamination in Engine 2, specifically," Ethan said. "Not the main supply, Engine 2 only. That means they weren't trying to bring the plane down cleanly. If they wanted the plane to crash, they would have hit both engines. One engine, you get a degraded aircraft, one that struggles, one that gives a pilot a bad enough day that he might make the wrong call, but one that a good pilot can land." Walter was very still. "Unless," Ethan said, "they weren't trying to crash the plane. They were trying to create a distraction or a delay, a diverted flight, an aircraft that ends up somewhere it wasn't supposed to be with passengers stuck on the ground in a city that wasn't their destination." "Why?" Walter said. "That's the question," Ethan said. "Why would someone need 183 people or one of them stuck in Eugene, Oregon, instead of Seattle?" Walter looked at him for a long time. "You need to say that to the FBI," he said. "I know. Tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight." Ethan looked at the terminal doors. "Yeah," he said. Walter put a hand on his shoulder, brief, firm, the way men who don't perform emotion communicated anyway, and then he walked to the bus. Ethan stood alone in the terminal for a long moment. I thought about the one-way ticket he'd bought with cash. He thought about the chapter meeting in Saddle that he may or may not have intended to actually attend. He thought about the road and the silence, and the small, manageable life he had assembled from the wreckage of the other one. He thought about Ryan Cooper. He thought about what Ryan would say, and then he pulled out his phone and called a number he hadn't called in 11 years. It rang 4 times. "Walker," said the voice on the other end. Rough with sleep or surprise or both. Male, mid-50s with the particular flatness of someone who had spent a career having conversations that didn't allow for sentiment. "Pike," Ethan said. "It's me." A pause. "I heard what happened," Pike said. "It's already on the news." "I need to know something." "Go ahead." 11 years ago when I left, was there anyone from the program who kept a file on me?" Another pause. Longer. "Ethan, what did you get yourself into?" "I don't know yet," Ethan said, "but I think somebody put me on that airplane for a reason. And I think when I figure out why, a lot of other things are going to make sense." He paused. "I need to know if I'm already in this or if I just became part of it today." The silence on the other end of the line was the specific silence of a man who knew an answer and was deciding whether to give it. "Come in," Pike said finally. "Don't talk to the FBI until you've talked to me." "Too late for that." "Then talk to me before you talk to them again." Ethan looked at the terminal doors. "I'll be there by morning," he said. He hung up. He stood for one more moment in the terminal of Eugene Springfield Airport in a quiet that had its own particular weight, the weight of something beginning that he didn't yet have a name for. Something that had started when he heard a frequency change in the bones of an airplane and ended with a phone call to a man he hadn't spoken to in 11 years. He picked up his bag, he walked out into the Oregon evening. And behind him in the isolated section of the apron, under yellow barriers and the careful attention of NTSB investigators, Flight 728 sat still and silent and waiting to give up its secrets. The drive to Portland took just under 2 hours. Ethan drove a rental, a gray sedan, anonymous. The kind of car nobody looks at twice, and he drove it the way he drove everything. Hands steady, eyes moving mine, somewhere between the road and the 11-year-old phone call he had just made and the conversation it implied. The Oregon evening was doing what Oregon evenings do, pressing down low and gray and damp, and the highway unrolled ahead of him with the indifferent patience of a thing that doesn't care where you're going or what you're carrying when you get there. I had not called his chapter. He would need to eventually. Big Tommy, the chapter president in Seattle, a man built like a refrigerator and possessing roughly the same emotional temperature, who had nonetheless been the first person to hand Ethan a beer and a key and say, "You're home," the night Ethan showed up on his doorstep 11 years ago, with nothing but a duffel bag and a face that had clearly been somewhere it couldn't come back from. Big Tommy would be watching the news. The story was already out. He'd seen the notifications coming through on his phone at the airport, and he'd ignored them the way he ignored most things that wanted to pull him into the center of someone else's frame. But Big Tommy would know, and Big Tommy would wait. That was the thing about the Brotherhood that civilians never understood. They saw the patches and the leather and the reputation, and they constructed a narrative that fit what they expected. What they never saw was the waiting, the particular quality of loyalty that didn't demand explanation, didn't require a call, didn't need you to perform your crisis in front of anyone. You showed up when you could. You were covered until you did. End of transaction. Ethan had spent 11 years being covered. He was starting to think he might need it in ways he hadn't anticipated. Pike's full name was Gerald Raymond Pike, but nobody had called him Gerald since approximately 1987, and Raymond only appeared on his pension paperwork. He was 58 years old, former Defense Intelligence Agency, former liaison to 3 separate Special Operations Aviation units, currently officially retired and living outside Portland in a house that he had purchased specifically because it was unremarkable, unfindable by casual inquiry, and equipped with a communication setup that most people would consider excessive for a man who claimed to spend his time growing tomatoes. The tomatoes were real. Pike genuinely grew them. He was very good at it. Everything else was also real. He was waiting on the porch when Ethan pulled in, not because he'd heard the car, or not only because of that, but because Pike had spent 31 years in intelligence, and waiting was not something he did. Waiting was something he performed while actually preparing. He looked older, obviously. 11 years did that, but the essential quality of him, the stillness, the economy of movement, the sense that every word he chose was preceded by the silent elimination of several others that was unchanged. "You look like hell," Pike said. "I landed a compromised aircraft 3 hours ago," Ethan said. "You look better than that then." Pike pushed the door open. "Come in. Coffee's on." The kitchen was exactly what you'd expect from a man who cooked for himself, kept a tight house, and had no patience for clutter. Pike poured 2 cups and set them on the table and sat down across from Ethan and looked at him with the particular quality of attention that Ethan remembered from a decade ago, the kind that made you feel that everything you said and didn't say was being recorded and filed in an internal system that never lost data. "Talk," Pike said. Ethan talked. He'd told Pike everything he'd told Webb, and then the part he hadn't told Webb yet, the single-engine specific contamination, the deliberate targeting logic, the theory about the diversion. He laid it out clean and sequential, the way he'd been trained to brief, and when he finished his coffee, was still half full, and Pike had not moved. "The fuel port," Pike said. "Engine 2 only. The contamination was introduced post-fueling at the aircraft level. The badge was cloned from a legitimate employee who happened to call in sick. Whoever planned this had inside access to the crew scheduling system, the maintenance protocols, and enough aircraft systems knowledge to get the dosage right enough to cause degraded performance and eventual engine failure without triggering immediate ground alerts. That's not a one-person operation, Pike said. No, it's not. And you think the diversion was intentional. One engine targeting, that's what makes sense to me. You want a clean crash, you hit both engines. You want a specific outcome, a delayed aircraft, a diverted airport passengers and crew, stuck somewhere off their intended route, you make it survivable but complicated. Ethan looked at his coffee, which means somebody needed Flight 728 to not arrive in Seattle. Or needed something that was on Flight 728 to not arrive in Seattle, Pike said. Ethan looked. Pike's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did a small, specific movement that Ethan recognized because he'd seen it before in briefing rooms a decade ago, when Pike was looking at a piece of information that connected to something he was already carrying. What do you know? Ethan said. Tell me first why you called me specifically, Pike said. Out of everyone you could have called after 11 years. Because you're the only person I know who would already be aware if someone from my past had a reason to put me on that plane. The silence was long. You think this is about you, Pike said. I think it might be, or I think I might be adjacent to whoever it's actually about. Ethan set down his cup. Pike, what's been moving in the last 6 months that would have a Phoenix to Seattle corridor as part of its operational geography? Pike looked at him for a moment longer than felt comfortable. Then he stood up, went to the counter, refilled his coffee, came back, sat down and said, There's a man named Victor Kale. The name meant nothing to Ethan immediately. He turned it over. Arms broker, Pike said. Not the obvious kind, not the kind that makes headlines because he's selling to state actors or terrorist organizations. The quiet kind, the kind that brokers the movement of components, specific components, technical components, the kind that individually mean nothing and collectively mean something catastrophic. He's been active for about 4 years. We've been aware of him for 3. He's very careful. He doesn't move in straight lines. He doesn't use the same method twice. What does he have to do with Flight 728? Potentially nothing, Pike said. Potentially everything. He paused. One of his contacts, someone we've been watching very carefully for about 8 months, flew out of Phoenix this morning. Flight 728. The weight of that landed. Who? Ethan said. A woman named Sandra Reeves, Pike said. 44, she presents as a corporate consultant, legitimate business history. Nothing that flags in a standard background check. But she's been a relay point for Kale's component pipeline for at least 14 months. She moves information, not physical material information, the kind that tells the physical material where to go. She was on my flight, Ethan said. She was supposed to be on your flight, Pike said. What we didn't know, what I didn't know until about an hour ago when I started making calls, was whether she made it to Eugene or whether the diversion changed her plan. Why would the diversion change her plan if she was a passenger she diverted with everyone else? Because her contact in Seattle, Pike said, was waiting at the airport. And now that contact knows the flight didn't arrive, which means the contact knows something went wrong. Which means anything Sandra Reeves was carrying physically, digitally in her head is now in a holding pattern. And someone on Kale's side of things is very unhappy about it. Ethan stared at him. You're telling me, he said slowly, that the sabotage might have been aimed at stopping the information transfer, not crashing the plane, not killing anyone, just disrupting the delivery. That's one possibility, Pike said. What's another? That someone on Kale's side sabotaged the plane to isolate Sandra Reeves, to make her unreachable, to put her in a place, Eugene, Oregon, stuck in a hotel with a bunch of stranded passengers where she's easier to access than an airport with a live itinerary and security cameras on the arrivals level. Ethan felt the back of his neck change temperature. She's in the hotel, he said, with everyone else from the flight. Yes, Pike said. And if someone on Kale's operation was specific enough to introduce contamination at the aircraft level with a cloned maintenance badge, Ethan said, they're specific enough to have someone waiting in Eugene. That, Pike said, is exactly what I've been thinking for the last 45 minutes. Ethan was already standing. You need to contact the FBI, he said. I've already started that process, but it takes time. The jurisdictional coordination between DIA legacy channels An active FBI takes longer than either of us would like. Pike was also standing. It's going to be at least 2 hours before they have someone at that hotel with full situational briefing. 2 hours, Ethan said. Yes. Who's in that hotel right now that knows any of this? Nobody, Pike said. The words sat between them like a door left open in a cold wind. Ethan looked at Pike. Pike looked back at him. I'm not asking you to do anything, Pike said carefully. You've already done more today than anyone had a right to ask. And whatever you think you owe to Ryan to anyone, this isn't a debt you can pay by putting yourself back in the middle of something you walked away from. I know that, Ethan said. I'm serious, Ethan. I know you are. Ethan picked up his keys. I'm not going back because of Ryan. I'm going back because there are 183 people in a hotel in Eugene who don't know that the reason they're there might be in the room next to them, and whatever comes for her is going to come in a building full of civilians. Pike was quiet. Sandra Reeves, Ethan said. What does she look like? Pike told him. Ethan moved toward the door. Ethan. Pike's voice stopped him. It had a quality in it that Pike's voice rarely carried, something underneath the flat professionalism that was, if not sentiment exactly, then the thing adjacent to it. You came back from worse than this. On the plane today. Whatever you've been telling yourself for 11 years about what you are and aren't, the plane today is the truth. That's who you actually are. Ethan looked at him. Tell that to Ryan, he said. He walked out. He drove back toward Eugene faster than he'd come. The rental car's engine was insufficient for what he was asking of it, and he asked, anyway, the way you ask things of something when the alternative is unacceptable. His phone was on the seat beside him, and he made one call to a number in his contacts listed only as T, and the call was answered in 2 rings. I saw the news, said Big Tommy. His voice was exactly what it always was. A wall that somehow also functioned as a door. I need something, Ethan said. Name it. I need you to call the Eugene chapter. I need someone at the Comfort Inn on Highway 99 in the next 40 minutes. Not obvious, not a crowd. 1 or 2 max who can move quietly and watch a room without it being a thing. A pause. Not hesitation. Tommy didn't hesitate. Assessment. This related to the plane directly. Is this sanctioned? It will be in about 2 hours. Right now it's a gap I'm trying to fill. Tommy was quiet for 4 seconds. 4 seconds was a long time for Tommy. Prospect named Decker is 20 minutes from that location, Tommy said. Solid kid. Did 3 years before the club. He knows how to be invisible when he needs to be. Tell him I'm coming in about 50 minutes and to watch the lobby. Woman named Sandra Reeves, mid-40s, medium, height, dark hair cut short, probably traveling alone. He doesn't approach, he doesn't engage. He watches and he calls me if anyone comes in asking for her or if she tries to leave. Done, Tommy said. Tommy? Yeah. Thank you. Stop, Tommy said with the specific gruffness of a man who finds gratitude structurally inconvenient. Your family. This is what we do. Ian hung up. Ethan drove. 1. Sandra Reeves was in room 214. She didn't know that Ethan knew this. She didn't know anyone knew this, or she thought she didn't, which was a different thing. She was sitting on the edge of the hotel bed with her shoes still on and her phone in her hands and the television on, but muted, and she had been in this precise configuration for the better part of an hour because she didn't know what her next move was, and she was waiting for instruction that wasn't coming. The instruction wasn't coming because her contact in Seattle knew the flight had diverted. The contact had gone dark, standard protocol, when the operational environment changed unexpectedly, and Sandra was left in a Eugene, Oregon hotel room with a head full of information she was supposed to have delivered 6 hours ago, and a very unpleasant awareness that going dark cut both ways. She had checked out the hotel, the lobby, the exits, the sight lines. Old habit, deep training. She had seen the standard mix of displaced travelers from her flight airport staff. A couple of people who might be journalists and a young man near the lobby bar who was drinking slowly and watching the door with a specific quality of attention that she recognized from her own professional toolkit. She had been doing this long enough to know that the man near the bar was not a hotel guest killing time. She had been doing this long enough to know that this was a problem. She was standing up, reaching for her bag, running the calculation of whether to stay or move when someone knocked on her door. 3 knocks. Even. Not urgent. She stopped. She did not say who is it in the reflexive way of someone who'd spent their life in ordinary rooms. She stood very still and placed her bag against the wall within reach and moved to the side of the door. Sandra Reeves, said the voice on the other side, male, even carrying the particular quality of someone who was not going to perform patience, but was actually going to exercise it. My name is Ethan Walker. I was in seat 5A today. I'm alone. I'm not armed. I need 5 minutes of your time, and I think you already know why. Silence. I know about Cale, Ethan said quietly through the door. I know about the contact in Seattle, and I know the man in the lobby bar isn't a hotel guest. A pause. If you run, you're going to walk right past him and into whatever's waiting behind him. Your best option is to talk to me. The door opened. She was sharper in person than Pike's description had fully conveyed. Not in appearance, that was accurate enough, but in quality. The way she looked at him when she opened that door was not the look of someone who was afraid. It was the look of someone who was running an extremely fast assessment and not letting the assessment show on her face while she ran it. She saw the vest. She saw the tattoos. She saw his hands, both visible exactly as promised, nothing in them. She stepped back and let him in. He came in. He did not move toward her. He stood inside the door at the distance a person stands at when they want to make clear they are not trying to close space, and he looked at her the way he had looked at Daniel Brooks in the cockpit, not with aggression, not with authority, with the specific density of a man who was going to say what was true and wait for you to decide what to do with it. How did you find me? She said. Her voice was controlled, professional, the voice of someone who had trained herself out of revealing distress. Former DIA contact identified you as a person of interest connected to Victor Cale, Ethan said. You've been on their radar for about 8 months. Her jaw tightened. Her jaw tightened. Barely, but he saw it. And you're what exactly, she said. You're not FBI. You're not DIA. You fly a plane and then you show up at my door. I was a military aviation rescue specialist for 15 years, Ethan said. And I noticed that the fuel contamination on today's flight was localized to engine 2, which means the plane was sabotaged to divert, not to crash. And when I thought about why someone would want to divert this specific flight, your name came up. She looked at him. The man in the lobby, he said. You saw him? Yes. He's with me. He's not a threat to you. But whoever put contaminated fuel in that engine 2 may have someone else in this building who is, he paused. How much do you know about what's waiting for you? She was quiet for a long moment. The television flickered on its mute setting. Outside the room, the regular sounds of a hotel footsteps elevator. The distant murmur of someone's conversation continued with the perfect indifference of a world that didn't know what was happening inside room 214. I know my contact went dark, she said finally. I know the diversion wasn't random. I know that if Cale's people were the ones who put me here, it means they know I've been compromised. She looked at him steadily. And if they know I've been compromised, they're not coming to extract me. They're coming to clean up. The word clean up carried in it everything it needed to carry. How long have you been working with DIA? Ethan said. Her expression shifted very slightly, very controlled. 7 months, she said. Then you're their asset. I'm their problem right now, she said, because I'm sitting in a hotel in Eugene instead of delivering what I was supposed to deliver in Seattle. And the window for that delivery closes at midnight tonight. And if it closes, 14 months of intelligence work closes with it. What were you delivering? She looked at him. I'm not going to answer that, she said. Fair. Ethan looked at the door. What I need to know is whether the people who diverted this plane already know you're in this room. If they know I'm compromised, they know where I am, she said. That's basic tradecraft. All stranded passengers were bused to 2 hotels. This is the closer one, room 214, as they'd have access to the booking system if they have inside access to airport operations, which they clearly do. Then we need to move you, Ethan said. Where? Not here. Not anywhere they can predict from the standard displaced passenger protocol. He looked at her. Do you trust me? She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the Hells Angels patch. She looked at the face of a man who had, by every account she'd just been handed, walked through a door he didn't have to walk through 3 times today, and each time walked through it for someone else's benefit. I don't trust anyone, she said, but I trust your math. Good enough, Ethan said. Get your bag. They came out of room 214 into the corridor, and moved toward the stairwell. Ethan had identified the exit patterns from the lobby level when he came in, the way he always identified exit patterns without deciding to. Decker, the prospect Tommy had sent, was a compact young man with close-cut hair and the stillness of someone who had learned to be furniture when the situation required it. He fell in beside them without being asked and without explanation, and the three of them moved through the stairwell with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that the speed of a group is only as fast as its least committed member, and none of them were uncommitted. They came out through the side entrance into the parking area. Ethan's rental was 30 feet away. They were 12 feet from it when the second man appeared. Not from the hotel, from the parking area itself, from between two vehicles, moving with the specific purposefulness of someone who had been waiting rather than arriving. Medium height, heavy build, moving his right hand toward his jacket with the particular intention that made Decker's posture change and Ethan's body make a decision before his mind finished framing it. What happened next took approximately 6 seconds. Ethan stepped forward and to the left between the man and Sandra, and he said very clearly and very quietly, "Federal investigation, you need to stop moving." The man stopped, not because of the words, because of the quality of the person saying them, because there is a specific kind of stillness that some men carry, men who have operated in environments where hesitation was the most expensive thing available, and it communicates something beyond words, something that the body reads before the brain gets there. The man's hand came away from his jacket. He looked at Ethan. He looked at the vest. He looked at Decker. He made a calculation. He turned and walked away fast back between the cars, and then he was running, and then he was gone. The whole thing was over before Sandra had finished her first exhale. "Get in the car," Ethan said. They got in the car. Ethan called Pike from the driver's seat before he started the engine. "We've got a problem," he said. "Tell me." "Sandra Reeves is with me. Someone made contact in the hotel parking area. He's gone, but he knows she moved. Whatever timeline you're working on for FBI coordination, compress it." A pause. The sound of Pike doing several things simultaneously, which was a sound Ethan recognized from years ago. The particular quality of someone whose external stillness and internal processing had no relationship to each other. "Where are you going?" Pike said. "Somewhere that's not on any passenger manifest or hotel booking," Ethan said. "I'll tell you when I get there." "Ethan, Pike, you've got an asset who is 4 hours from the end of a 14-month intelligence operation and the window closes at midnight. Tell me what she was delivering and I'll tell you if there's a way to make this work." Silence. "That is so far outside what I can authorize," Pike started. "Gerald," Ethan said. He had not called Pike by his first name in 11 years. Possibly ever. The silence on the other end changed its quality entirely. "The information Sandra was carrying," Pike said slowly, "is the location of Cale's primary component transfer point, the physical address where the pieces come together before they move to the end buyer. We've been trying to locate that point for 8 months. She had it. She was delivering it in person to avoid any digital transmission risk." He paused. "If she can transmit that information to the right person through the right channel, before midnight, we can move on Cale's operation tonight. While the transfer is still happening, after midnight they move, and once they move, we lose them." Sandra, in the backseat, was listening. Her face was composed, professional, but something behind her eyes was working very hard. "Sandra," Ethan said, not turning around, "you've been in this room for 14 months. You know the cost if Cale's operation completes this transfer." She was quiet. "Yes," she said. "Then tell me what you need and let's finish it." She looked at the back of his head. She looked at the vest across his shoulders. She thought about Cale and the 14 months of careful, exhausting, lonely work she had done inside an operation that required her to be someone she wasn't every single day. She thought about the component transfer, what it was, where it was going, what it would enable at its destination. "I need a secure line," she said. "Pike can give you one," Ethan said. "I need to be somewhere stable for at least 30 minutes. "I know a place," Decker said from the front passenger seat. His first words since the hotel. He said it simply, without drama, the way the young man had handled everything since Tommy called him, with the straightforward competence of someone who understood that the moment required function, not performance. 20 minutes from here, former chapter member, lives alone, reliable. He won't ask questions." Ethan looked at him. Make the call, Ethan said. Decker made the call. Ethan started the car. Sandra sat in the back with her bag on her lap and her hands wrapped around it, and the expression of someone who had spent 14 months being alone inside something difficult and was recalibrating in real time to what it felt like to be inside it with people who were actually on her side. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was something better than comfortable. It was the feeling of the ground when you've been airborne a very long time. They drove. The night was fully dark now. The highway had thinned out to occasional lights in the kind of quiet that accumulates in rural Oregon after 9 in the evening. Inside the car, nobody spoke for the first 10 minutes, and the silence was not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who were processing too much to filter it into words yet. Decker broke it. "Can I ask you something?" he said. He was talking to Ethan. "Go ahead." On the plane, when the intercom asked for anyone with flight experience. He paused. "What made you stand up? Because I watched it on the news, they had people talking about it. Other passengers, and one woman said, there was this moment where she thought you weren't going to." Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "She was right," he said. "So what changed it?" "The road, the quiet, the dark outside the windows. Old man in row 3, Ethan said something." "What did he say?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "He said you can take off the jacket, but you can't take out what's in you." He paused. And then the plane dropped. Decker nodded slowly like a person receiving something he intended to keep. In the back seat, Sandra was looking out the window. She was thinking about what Ethan had said in the hotel doorway. Your best option is to talk to me, and the specific quality of certainty it had carried. Not arrogance, not performance. The certainty of a man who had looked at a situation clearly and was simply telling you what he saw. She had spent 14 months among people for whom every statement was a layer on top of another statement, where nothing said was the thing meant, and every gesture was the surface of a calculation. She had forgotten what it felt like to be in a room with someone who just meant what they said. "Walker," she said. Ethan looked at her in the rear view. "Why are you doing this?" she said. "Not the plane, that I understand, but this, the hotel, moving me, calling your contact." She held his reflection in the mirror. "You don't have to be here." Ethan looked back at the road. "No," he said. "So why?" "I thought about Ryan." He thought about the decision that was correct by the manual and wrong in every way that mattered. He thought about 11 years of road of motion, of the small contained life that asked nothing of him. He thought about Lily's rabbit in Diane Kowalski's hands, and Daniel Brooks saying, "You didn't do this alone." "Because the plane didn't finish it," he said. "Landing everyone alive, that finished one thing, but if whoever sabotaged that aircraft is connected to something that's going to hurt people down the line, and I had the chance to do something about it, and I drove to a hotel and slept." He stopped. "Then landing everyone alive just becomes the first part of a sentence I never finished." Sandra looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back out the window. "The location Cale's been hiding," she said quietly. "The transfer point." She paused. "It's a warehouse outside Tacoma. The components arrive tonight specifically between 11 and 11:30. If the FBI can move on before 11, the transfer doesn't complete. The buyer never gets what they're coming for. And Cale, for the first time in 4 years, has no place to hide." She had told him. She had not been asked. She had simply decided. Ethan looked at her in the rear view one more time. He didn't say anything. He picked up his phone and called Pike. "Tacoma warehouse," he said when Pike answered. "Sandra has the details. Get her on a secure line and..." He looked at Decker. 12 minutes, Decker said. 12 minutes, Ethan told Pike. "Have your FBI contact standing by." He set the phone down. The car moved through the dark. 12 minutes. 14 months of work. A window that closed at midnight. And a biker in a rental car who had stood up on an airplane 6 hours ago because an old man said something true about who he was and had not yet found a reason to sit back down. The house belonged to a man named Garrett Cole, former Hells Angels Eugene chapter, medically retired 4 years ago after a back injury that ended his riding and started a quieter life that he'd spent the first year resenting and the following 3 years accepting, with the particular grace of someone who had learned late that stillness was not the same as defeat. He was 51 broad through the shoulders, with a gray beard and a kitchen that smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the specific comfort of a house lived in by one person who had made peace with their own company. He opened the door before Decker knocked. He looked at the three of them, Decker, Ethan, and Sandra, who looked like none of them were supposed to be here, which was accurate, and he stepped back and said, "Come in," without asking a single question, because Tommy had called ahead. And when Tommy called, Garrett operated on the simple principle that the explanation would arrive eventually, and in the meantime there was coffee and a table and whatever these people needed. "I need your landline," Sandra said as soon as the door closed. Garrett pointed at the kitchen counter. She went to it without breaking stride, picked it up, confirmed it had a dial tone, looked at Ethan. "Pike's number," she said. Ethan gave it to her from memory. She dialed. Pike answered in one ring, which meant he had been sitting with his hand close to the phone for the last 12 minutes, which meant he already knew this was coming, which was Pike in his essence, always already prepared for the thing that hadn't happened yet. "It's Sandra," she said. "I'm on a secure residential line. Trace it later if you need to. Right now, I need your FBI contact on this call in the next 90 seconds. A pause of perhaps 4 seconds. "Hold," Pike said. She held. Ethan stood near the door. Decker sat in a chair near the window and kept his eyes on the road outside with the relaxed vigilance of someone who could do that for hours without it costing him anything. Garrett put a mug of coffee on the table near Ethan without being asked and moved back to his own chair with the instinctive courtesy of a man who understood that the most useful thing he could do right now was occupy as little space as possible. The hold lasted 40 seconds. Then a new voice came on the line. Female clipped the voice of someone in motion who had been briefed on the way to the phone. "This is Special Agent Donna Reyes, FBI Portland Field Office." "Sandra." "Yes," Sandra said. "Confirm your identity." Phrase. Sandra said 4 words quietly enough that only she and the phone could hear them. "Confirmed," Reyes said. "Talk to me." Sandra talked. She laid it out with the precision of someone who had been composing this briefing in her head for months, waiting for the moment she would finally be able to say it to the right person. The warehouse location outside Tacoma, a specific address on a specific access road building, 3 of an industrial complex that presented as a refrigerated logistics company. The transfer window, 11 to 11:30, give or take, based on the movement patterns she had documented over 6 months of observation. The receiving party, 2 individuals whose names she gave clearly and without hesitation, names that Reyes clearly already had because the agent's breathing changed when she heard them. The component specifications, and here Sandra used technical language that Ethan partially understood and partly didn't, but understood enough to know that what was being transferred was not small and not theoretical and not the kind of thing that ended anywhere good. It took 11 minutes. When Sandra finished, there was a silence on the line. Then Reyes said, "We can move on this. You have to be in position by 10:45 at the latest," Sandra said. "The transfer crew sweeps the access road before they open the loading dock. If they see federal vehicles, we know how to do this," Reyes said. It wasn't dismissive. It was the confidence of someone who was already assembling the pieces in her head and didn't need to be told what she already knew. "I know you do," Sandra said. "I just spent 14 months making sure this moment would work. I'm protective of it." A beat. "Understood," Reyes said. "And then you did good work, Sandra. 14 months is a long time to be inside something like this." Sandra's hand tightened on the phone. "Yeah," she said. Her voice was even, but only just. "Get them." She hung up. She stood at the kitchen counter with the phone in her hand for a moment that had a particular quality to it, the quality of someone who has been running towards something for a very long time and has now released it, and the body doesn't quite know what to do with the absence of the running. Then she set the phone down. She turned around. Ethan was looking at her. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He nodded once. She sat down at Garrett's kitchen table, put her elbows on it, pressed her face into her hands, and stayed there for about 20 seconds. Nobody in the room said anything. Nobody tried to fill it. Garrett refilled his coffee. Decker watched the window. Ethan stood where he was and let the 20 seconds be what they needed to be. Then Sandra lifted her head. Her eyes were clear. Her jaw was set. "Now what?" she said. The now what turned out to be complicated. Not operationally, that part at least was out of their hands and in Reyes's. What was complicated was the increasingly urgent reality that the man who had made contact in the hotel parking lot had not been working alone and had not been working blind. He had known which hotel, he had known the booking, he had known enough to be in position in the parking area at the specific time Sandra was attempting to move. which meant Kale's people had inside access not just to Phoenix, Sky Harbor's maintenance operations, but to the passenger relocation logistics, which meant they were still ahead of the official process. Ethan was the one who said it first because Ethan was the one whose job it had always been to say the thing the room was thinking but hadn't formed into words yet. "They know she moved," he said. "The man in the parking lot reported back before we got out of the city. They don't know where she is. If they knew where she was, they'd already be here, but they know she's mobile, and they know she's not in the hotel system anymore." "They'll cover the obvious routes," Sandra said. "Airport, rental car return, bus terminal. They might also run the passenger manifest, looking for anyone with connections in the area," Decker said. He said it quietly, like someone who wasn't sure if the observation was useful but offered it anyway. The three of them looked at him. "They're looking for her," Decker said, "but they don't know who helped her move. If they run the manifest and find anyone with a local connection in Eugene, anyone who might have offered shelter, they start narrowing the field." Garrett set down his coffee cup. He looked at Decker. He looked at Ethan. "This is my house," he said. It was not a complaint. It was a statement of fact delivered with the calm of a man who had made peace with consequences, being the natural partners of choices. "I'm on that manifest. The Eugene Chapter Association could surface if they're thorough enough," Ethan said. "I'm sorry, Garrett. I didn't anticipate." "Stop." Garrett waved it off. "How long do you need?" "Until the FBI completes the operation in Tacoma," Ethan said. "Maybe 90 minutes. Maybe 2 hours." "Then you've got it." Garrett stood up. "What do you need from me while you're here?" "A quiet room," Sandra said, "and someone to tell me if a car they haven't seen before comes down your road slowly." "I can do that," Garrett said. He went to the front window and stood beside it in the dark with the patient, unshowy confidence of a man who had done harder things than watch a road. Ethan and Sandra sat at the kitchen table. Decker was near the window with Garrett. The house was quiet except for the sounds houses make when they settle into themselves at night. Outside, the road was dark, an occasional a passing car every few minutes. Nothing that slowed, nothing that showed interest. Sandra looked at Ethan across the table. "Tell me about Ryan Cooper," she said. Ethan looked at her. "Pike told me," she said, "not directly, but when he was briefing me on who you were. He said you left aviation after losing a partner." He said the name. "Pike talks more than he thinks he does," Ethan said. "He talks exactly as much as he means to," Sandra said. "He wanted me to know. I think he thought it would help me trust you." She paused. "Was he right?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Whatever you wanted to say." He looked at his coffee. He thought about the last time he had talked about Ryan, really talked, not just offered the compressed official version, and realized he couldn't identify it. The compressed version was clean and functional partner mission decision loss. It moved through a conversation efficiently and left nothing behind for anyone to hold. That was the point. "We grew up in the program together," Ethan said. "Same training cycle, same unit. He was from Alabama, Tuscaloosa, one of 5 kids. His father drove trucks. He had this way of talking about his family like they were the funniest people who'd ever lived, like growing up in that house was a comedy that he happened to be the luckiest audience member of." He paused. "He was the best reader of a situation I ever worked with. Not technically, I had more flight hours. My instrument ratings were higher, but he could look at a scenario and see the whole board, all the pieces, where they were going to be in 30 seconds. Like chess," Sandra said. "He used to say it's not chess because chess is symmetrical and real situations never are. He said it was more like water. You had to feel which way it was going to run before it ran." Ethan looked at his hands. "The day he died, we had a search and rescue situation. Pilot down behind a line we weren't supposed to cross. Ryan was my secondary. I was calling the approach, the extraction sequence, the egress route, everything by the manual, everything correct." He stopped. "He told me," he said, "Ethan, wait." Said it twice. "Wait." And I thought he was reading the tactical wrong. I thought he was hesitating, and I made the call. "And he followed your call," Sandra said. "He always followed my call." Ethan's voice was flat, not because he felt nothing, because the feeling had been compressed so many times over so many years that it had become its own kind of structure, dense load-bearing, holding up everything else. "The egress route I chose was the correct one by every standard in the manual, and there was a secondary threat on it that the manual didn't account for, and that Ryan, if I had waited 30 more seconds, would have seen." Sandra was quiet. He saw things 30 seconds ahead, Ethan said. That was his gift, and I didn't give him 30 seconds. The kitchen was very still. Outside, Garrett said quietly to Decker, "Nothing on the road," and Decker said, "Give it 10, and that small exchange, practical, watchful human, was somehow the thing that brought the room back into its present tense. "You know what he'd say," Sandra said. It wasn't a question. Ethan looked at her. "Men who knew people like that always do," she said. "They carry the voice. What would he say right now?" Ethan looked at the table. "He'd say the plane was not a coincidence," Ethan said quietly. "He'd say, Ethan, you don't end up in seat 5A on that flight by accident. He'd say the situation ran you there. The water found its level." He paused. "He'd say, stop carrying what's already been set down and start looking at what's in front of you." "Smart man," Sandra said. "The smartest I knew." She looked at him steadily, then listened to him. "Sorry, at 9:57, Ethan's phone buzzed. Pike. Text only, FBI in position, Tacoma. Operation running, standby." He showed it to Sandra. She read it. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. "Open them." "Now we wait," she said. Waiting for Ethan had never been passive. It was the time when the mind did its most dangerous work, running scenarios, finding the cracks in the completed thing, locating everything that could still go wrong. He knew this about himself and had learned over years to give the mind something to work on during the wait rather than letting it feed on anxiety. So he thought about the sabotage. I thought about what it had actually required. Not the logistics Pike and Reyes and their respective agencies would dismantle that. He thought about the decision-making behind it. The choice to compromise a fuel line rather than take a more direct approach. The precision of it. The calculation that said we don't need this plane to crash. We need this plane to not arrive. There was something in that precision that bothered him. Something that said the person who designed this operation thought in the same way Ethan thought in systems, in contingencies, in the question of what happens 3 moves out if this move fails. "Sandra," he said. She looked at him. "Cale," he said, "does he have anyone with aviation background on his operation?" She thought for a moment. "There's a logistics coordinator. Goes by Marsh. I never got a full name. He handled the movement patterns for the components, routing timing, the way each transfer was structured to avoid detection. He was former military, but I never confirmed what branch." She paused. "Why? Because what was done to that fuel line wasn't improvised," Ethan said. "The contamination dosage, the specific port access, the timing that made it fail at altitude, and not on the ground, that's someone who knows aircraft systems at a technical level. That's someone who's flown or maintained or both." Sandra's expression changed. "Marsh coordinated the entire diversion," she said slowly. "The contact at Phoenix, the badge clone, the booking system access. Marsh is your saboteur," Ethan said. "And if Cale's people know the FBI is moving tonight, Marsh is the one who told them how to disappear." He picked up the phone and called Pike. "The logistics coordinator," Ethan said when Pike answered. "Goes by Marsh, former military aviation background. He's the one who designed the fuel contamination. He's also the one who would know Cale needs to move the moment the Tacoma operation is compromised." "We already have Marsh," Pike said. Ethan stopped. "FBI picked him up 40 minutes ago at SeaTac," Pike said. "He was on a flight to Vancouver, one-way ticket, cash. They were waiting for him." A pause. "He's been cooperating since about 15 minutes in. Gave us 2 additional names and a secondary location." Ethan stared at the wall. "You knew," he said. "I suspected," Pike said. "The logistics profile you described, the precision, the aircraft-level access matched a name that surfaced in our Cale investigation 3 months ago. We just couldn't place it until tonight. And you sent me to Sandra because Marsh was the leak," Pike said. "Inside DIA, inside our chain. We didn't know how deep it went. We needed Sandra's information to move through a channel that Marsh couldn't monitor." Another pause, and in it was something that Pike would never call an apology but functioned as one. "You were the clean channel, Ethan. You were the one person in this sequence that Marsh couldn't have planned for. Because nobody puts an ex-military rescue specialist in seat 5A on a compromised flight. Nobody plans for that." The kitchen was very quiet. Ethan looked at Sandra. She had heard enough from his side of the conversation to understand most of it. Her face carried the particular expression of someone who has just learned that the last 14 months of their life were shaped by a variable that nobody in their chain of command had told them existed. Marsh was inside DIA, she said. Yes, Ethan said. For how long? He relayed the question. Unknown, Pike said. At least 8 months, possibly longer. Sandra pressed her lips together. She looked at the wall. She was running the 14 months backward in her head. Ethan could see it. Every briefing, every check-in, every piece of information she had passed up the chain, trying to identify what Marsh had seen, what he'd passed to Cale, how much of her operational security had been theater performed for an audience she didn't know was watching. Sandra, Ethan said. She looked at him. Your delivery still mattered, he said. Everything you gave Reyes tonight is what the FBI is running on right now. Whatever Marsh compromised this part tonight, he didn't get to touch. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, because of the biker in seat 5A. Because you did 14 months of work and you held on to it when everything went sideways, Ethan said. I just drove the car. She almost smiled. It was a small thing, but it was real. Then, at 10:48, Pike called back. Tacoma, he said. FBI is in. Transfer crew on site, buyers representatives on site, components accounted for. Cale's people are in custody. The buyer's representatives are, that's going to be a diplomatic situation, but that's above my level. A pause. It's done, Ethan. Ethan closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Sandra, Pike said. She's here, Ethan said. He handed the phone across the table. Sandra took it. Good work, Pike said. She held the phone and didn't say anything for a moment. Marsh, she said. We have him. Is he talking about it extensively? Apparently he decided that loyalty to Cale's operation was substantially less appealing once he was sitting in a federal holding room. I want to see the debrief, she said. You'll be part of it, Pike said. Reyes is going to want you in Portland in the morning. She looked at Ethan. I'll be there, she said. She handed the phone back. The room shifted. Not physically, but the kitchen was the same kitchen. Garrett's house was the same house, but the quality of the air in it changed the way air changes when the pressure system that's been bearing down on a place finally moves through. Decker exhaled from his position near the window and rolled his shoulders once and said, good, in the simple way of someone who doesn't waste words. Garrett came away from the window and went directly to refill the coffee and put a hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder as he passed, and in that hand was everything Garrett had to say about the last 2 hours. Ethan sat at the kitchen table. He was very tired. Not the tired of the approach that had been clean focused, the specific exhaustion of a body and mind that had been used at full capacity for a defined purpose. This was different. This was the tired that comes when the thing that's been holding you taut for hours finally releases and the body realizes how long it's been carrying the load. He thought about the moment on the plane when he'd almost not stood up. I thought about Walter Hayes saying you can take off the jacket, but you can't take out what's in you. He thought about Lily holding out a rabbit for a man who might be scared. He thought about Diane Kowalski's hands and the word hello that she'd been ashamed of not saying. I thought about Daniel Brooks, who had flown the approach, who had corrected before the call, who had done it because the training and the character had been there all along. He just hadn't known it until the moment required him to find out. He thought about Ryan. He thought about 30 seconds. And for the first time in 11 years, the thought of Ryan didn't arrive with the specific weight that it always carried. It arrived differently, quieter, more like a presence than an absence, more like something that had been standing in a doorway and had finally carefully sat down. He didn't know what to do with that. He held it carefully the way you hold something that might be fragile until you know whether it is. Sandra spoke quietly from across the table. What are you going to do now? She said. After tonight. Same as I was going to do this morning, Ethan said. Get to Seattle, see my chapter, figure out what's next. Is there a meeting? There was going to be. She looked at him. Are you going to fly again? He looked at his hands, the hands that had rested on the secondary controls of a compromised aircraft and felt the familiar weight of it come back like something that had never actually left. I don't know. Your certification, she said. Pike said it lapsed when you left the service, but lapses can be addressed. I know. You belong up there, she said simply. Not as flattery, not as persuasion, as observation, the way someone who has just watched a person do the exact thing they were made for will sometimes say the plain truth of what they saw. I belong on the road too, Ethan said. Maybe both, she said. He looked at her. She shrugged. Some people are made for more than one thing. They just spend a long time being convinced that they have to choose. She paused. 14 months I was Sandra Reeves' corporate consultant. 14 months I was also an intelligence asset. I was both things every single day, and the tension between them was enormous, but I never stopped being either one. She met his eyes. You're still a rescue specialist. You proved it today in a way that couldn't have been more definitive. You're also a biker. You're also whatever else you are that I don't know about. Those aren't in competition. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Ryan used to say that, he said. Not in those words, but the same idea. He said the problem isn't being too many things. The problem is being afraid that the things can't hold together. Smart man, Sandra said, the same word she'd used before. Yeah, Ethan said. His phone buzzed at 11:17. Not Pike this time, not Tommy, a number he didn't recognize, Oregon area code. He answered, Mr. Walker. The voice was careful, measured. Female. My name is Dr. Patricia Green. I'm a cardiologist at Peace Health Medical Center in Eugene. I'm calling about Captain James Mercer. Ethan sat up straighter. He's stable, she said quickly. I want you to know that first. He's stable and his prognosis is good. But he's been asking since he came around about an hour ago. He's been asking about the person who assisted on the flight. He knows there was someone. He doesn't know who. A pause. He asked if there was any way to speak with them. I told him I'd try. Ethan was quiet. I'll come in the morning, he said. I'll let him know, she said. He hung up. Sandra was watching him. Captain's awake, Ethan said. She nodded. He set the phone down and looked at the table and thought about a man he had never met who had been lying unconscious while Ethan sat in his seat and brought his airplane home. A man who would have to live with the knowledge that his aircraft had been sabotaged, that his crew had been put in an impossible situation, that someone had used his flight as an instrument of something much larger than any of them had known when they pushed back from the gate in Phoenix that afternoon. A man who had a family waiting. Ethan knew because he had checked on the approach old habit, the kind of thing you do without deciding to the captain's next of kin listed in the crew manifest. Wife in Seattle, 2 sons. He thought about what it would mean for those sons to have their father come home. He thought about the difference between the families who got that phone call and the families who didn't. I thought about all the times in 15 years of rescue work when he had been the person who made the difference between those two groups. All the pilots he'd brought back. All the damaged aircraft he'd helped find their way to the ground. All the moments when being in the right place with the right knowledge had meant the difference between a family getting a person back and a family getting a flag. He had walked away from all of that. He had called it penance. He had called it the only honest response to what he had cost Ryan. He had told himself that the sky had taken enough from him and from the people around him and that the road asked less. But sitting in Garrett Cole's kitchen at 11:20 in the evening, with the FBI running a Tacoma warehouse, and a captain waking up in a hospital bed, and a one-way ticket to Seattle, still technically in his pocket, Ethan Walker began to understand something that he would spend the next several days thinking about more carefully. Penance and purpose were not the same thing. He had been confusing them. The road had not been penance. It had been hiding. And hiding had a cost too, not as visible as Ryan's cost, not as clean but real. The cost of every moment you spend becoming smaller than what you are. Every time you tuck the thing you're made for behind something you've chosen because it doesn't ask as much. Every approach that doesn't happen because the pilot decided to sit down. He didn't know yet what he was going to do with this. He only knew that this question had opened tonight in a way it hadn't been open in 11 years. And open questions in Ethan's experience had a way of demanding answers whether or not you felt ready to give them. Decker drove Sandra to the federal contact point at midnight. An FBI vehicle met them 2 miles from Garrett's house. Reyes had arranged it, the kind of quiet handoff that didn't require anyone to explain anything to anyone who wasn't already read in. Sandra got out of Decker's truck and stopped at the window before she went to the waiting vehicle. She looked at Ethan, who had come along for the transfer and was now standing at the side of the road in the dark with his hands in the pockets of his leather vest. The rabbit, she said. He looked at her. The little girl on the plane, Sandra said. She offered you her rabbit. You told her she needed it more than you did. She paused. But you borrowed it. You touched it. for just a second. She looked at him steadily. That's not a man who's done being brave. That's a man who's been scared to let himself be. Ethan said nothing. Stop being scared, she said. You're too good at the other thing. She turned and walked to the FBI vehicle without looking back. Ethan watched it until the taillights disappeared. He stood in the road in the dark in Oregon and thought about a rabbit and a 5-year-old's certainty in 30 seconds, and the way water finds the level it was always going to find. Then he walked back to the car. Decker was in the driver's seat. Where to? Decker said. Ethan looked at the road ahead. Seattle, he said. Eventually. He paused. Hospital first, in the morning. Decker nodded and started the engine. They drove back to Garrett's house through the dark Oregon night, and Ethan Walker sat in the passenger seat and did something he hadn't done in 11 years. He thought about the sky without flinching. I thought about what it would feel like to sit in the left seat again. Not the right seat, not the secondary, the left seat, with current instruments and a proper certification, in the specific weight of a flight plan that was his to execute. He thought about the approach he had flown today, the yaw, the correction, the crosswind, the runway coming up through the rain, and he held it without the grief he usually carried alongside it. Just the flying, just the thing itself. And it felt for the first time in a long time like something he might be allowed to have. Part 5, What You Carry Home. Captain James Mercer was awake when Ethan arrived at Peace Health Medical Center at 8:14 in the morning. Not just awake, sitting up, arguing mildly with a nurse about whether he needed the second IV line and losing the argument with the gracious resignation of a man who had spent 20 years commanding aircraft and understood that some authorities were not his to override. He was 61 years old, and he looked in that hospital bed like a man who had been reminded very suddenly and very clearly that he was 61 years old. The cardiac event had left its mark, not permanently. The doctors had been careful to say the prognosis was genuinely good. But the mark was there. A certain stillness in the face that hadn't been there before. The specific quality of a man reassessing the ledger. His wife, Carol, was in the chair beside the bed. She was a small woman with dark eyes and the posture of someone who had been holding herself together through an extremely long night by force of will alone, and was now in the morning light, allowing herself to come slightly undone at the edges now that the worst hadn't happened. She saw Ethan first. She stood up before he reached the door. She didn't say anything. She looked at the vest, the tattoos, the face, and then she crossed the room and took both his hands in hers and held them with a grip that communicated everything she apparently didn't have language for right now, which was fine because the grip was enough. Thank you, she said. Her voice was low and cracked at the edges. My boys they're flying in today. Because of you, they're flying in to see their father. Not for Peter. She stopped, collected herself. Thank you. Ethan looked at her. He brought it home, he said. His crew, his aircraft. I just helped with the last part. She shook her head slightly, the way people shake their heads when they appreciate the generosity of a statement and simultaneously refuse to accept its terms. She released his hands and stepped back, and Captain James Mercer looked at Ethan Walker from his hospital bed with the specific expression of a man meeting the person who was inside his cockpit while he was unconscious and not entirely knowing how to begin. Sit down, Mercer said. His voice was still strong, rough at the edges, but the authority in it was unchanged. The voice of someone who had been telling people where to be for 20 years. Ethan sat. Carol quietly excused herself to the hallway with the instinct of a woman who understood that some conversations needed the room they were in. Mercer looked at him for a long moment. Daniel briefed me, Mercer said. This morning, first thing. He was here when I woke up. A pause. He said you identified fuel contamination in 11 seconds. The pattern was familiar, Ethan said. He said you called Eugene before he'd finished assessing the options. Shorter approach, less traffic, better weather window than Portland. Mercer nodded slowly. He said you told him he flew the approach, not you. He did. He said you called every adjustment at exactly the right moment, and without you he would have gone left of center line at 200 feet and the outcome would have been different. Ethan said nothing. So I'm going to need you to accept, Mercer said, that what you're telling me and what actually happened are two related but not identical things. Ethan looked at him. You saved my aircraft, Mercer said. Not loudly, not with drama, with the flat, clear delivery of a man who had been trained like Ethan to say what was true without decorating it. You saved my crew. You saved 183 people who had no idea what was happening above them. And you did it wearing a Hells Angels vest in a cockpit you had no authorization to be in, with a certification that lapsed 11 years ago because nobody else on that airplane was going to do it. He paused. That's the actual event. I want to make sure we agree on what the actual event was. Okay, Ethan said. Okay, Mercer said. He settled back slightly. Now tell me what you were doing on my flight. So Ethan told him. Not everything, not the full scope of what had unfolded in Eugene after the landing, not Sandra or Pike or Kale or the Tacoma warehouse, because that was not his to tell, and the FBI would be doing their own briefing to the airline and the crew in due course. But he told Mercer the part that was his, the one-way ticket, the chapter meeting, the choice of seat 5A, because he wanted quiet. And the moment the frequency and the vibration changed, and something in him recognized it before he decided to. Mercer listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, Mercer said, 15 years, aviation rescue. Yes. And you've been out for 11. Yes. Why? Ethan looked at the window. Outside, the morning was coming in clean and pale, and the kind of clear that only shows up after rain. I lost a partner, a decision I made. He was following my call. Mercer was quiet. The decision was correct, Ethan said. By every standard. I've had 11 years to review it from every angle available. But Mercer said, but correct and right are not always the same place, Ethan said, and I didn't know how to live in that gap. Mercer looked at him steadily. What did you do instead? Road, Ethan said. Chapter. A life that didn't ask what I used to be. Did it work? Ethan almost smiled. It worked until yesterday afternoon. Mercer looked at the ceiling for a moment. He was a man who thought before he spoke, not slowly but with intention, and the quality of his silence was never empty. I've had 2 cardiac events in my life, Mercer said. This is the second. The first was a minor one 6 years ago. The doctors told me then that I needed to make changes. I made some of them, not all. He paused. I kept flying because flying was the only place I felt entirely myself. Everything else, the paperwork, the meetings, the politics of the airline, I did it because it was the cost of being in the cockpit. But when I was actually up there doing the actual thing, I was completely alive in a way I wasn't anywhere else. He looked at Ethan. You know what that feels like. It wasn't a question. Yes, Ethan said. Then you know, Mercer said that there is no version of walking away from it that doesn't cost something. I'm not saying the road was wrong. I'm not saying the chapter was wrong. I'm saying a man who can do what you did yesterday, who carries that ability in his hands, in his instincts, and his bones giving that up, is not neutral. It has a price, and I think you've been paying it. Ethan sat with that. My certification, he said after a moment, can be reinstated? Mercer said immediately, like he had already thought about this. I have contacts at the FAA. Your military record is impeccable. The lapse is procedural, not performance-based. It would take time, recurrency training, check rides the process, but it's not closed. Ethan looked at him. Why would you do that? Because you brought my airplane home, Mercer said simply. And because the world needs people like you in the sky more than it needs them hiding from it. He paused. Will you think about it? Ethan looked at his hands. I've been thinking about it since about 11 o'clock last night, he said. Mercer almost smiled. It pulled at the corner of his mouth and settled there. Good. Carol came back in with coffee she'd found somewhere in the hospital. The good kind from a cart, not the waiting room burnt offering, and she handed one to Ethan without being asked and sat back down beside her husband. And the 3 of them existed quietly in that room for a few minutes in the way that people do when they have been through something together, even at different levels of proximity, and the shared weight of it creates a temporary gravity that makes conversation unnecessary. Then Mercer said, there's something else. He reached to the bedside table. There was a folded piece of paper there. He held it out. Ethan took it, unfolded it. It was a handwritten note. The handwriting was careful, the handwriting of someone who had taken time with it, who had thought about each word before committing it to the page. It said, Mr. Walker, you don't know how to write this, so I'm just going to write it. My name is Anna Cooper. My father was Ryan Cooper. I think you knew him. I saw your name on the news last night, and I looked up everything I could find, and I found a photograph from your unit from about 15 years ago, and you're in it standing next to my dad. I've been trying to find a way to contact you for about 3 years. I just never knew how to start. If you're willing to talk, I'd like to. I'm not angry. I want you to know that first. I just want to know who he was, Anna. Ethan sat very still. The paper was in his hands and the words were in front of him, and his body had made the specific decision to not move while his mind caught up to what he was reading. Anna Cooper was 20 years old. He had been counting since she was 3. She had been looking for him for 3 years. She was not angry. She wanted to know who her father was. How did she find you? Ethan said. His voice was level. It cost him something to keep it that way. She saw the news and did what 20-year-olds do. She searched everything, Mercer said quietly. She found the unit photograph. She found my flight. She found my name in the news reports. She called the hospital this morning. He paused. I told her I'd give you the note. The decision is yours entirely. Ethan looked at the paper. I thought about what he had said to himself for 11 years, that he didn't deserve to contact her. That reaching out would be an imposition, that the best thing he could do for Ryan's daughter was stay away and let her build a life that wasn't shadowed by the specific darkness of what he had cost her. He had been so certain of that logic. Sitting here now with the note in his hands, he could see it for what it had actually been. Not protection, not selflessness, fear. He had been afraid of what she would say, afraid of what he would see in her face, afraid of sitting across from Ryan's daughter and having her ask him the question he had been asking himself for 11 years and not having an answer that was good enough. She had said, I'm not angry. She had said, I want to know who he was. She had said, I just want to know. He folded the paper carefully. He put it in the inside pocket of his vest close to his chest. Okay, he said. Mercer nodded. He called Anna Cooper from the parking lot. She answered on the second ring, which told him she had been waiting near her phone, which told him that reaching out had cost her something too, and that she had paid it anyway. She was 20 years old, and her voice carried in it the particular quality of someone who was trying very hard to be steady and mostly succeeding. Mr. Walker, she said. Ethan, he said. Please. A pause. Ethan. He stood in the parking lot in the Oregon morning with his hand around his phone and the other hand at his side, and he said, Your father was the best person I ever worked with. He was better at the job than me in about 6 ways I can name, and probably more I never figured out. He had this ability to see the whole situation at once. He called it reading the water, and I have spent 11 years wishing I had given him 30 more seconds to use it. Silence on the line. Then he talked about you. Ethan waited. He called you the most stubborn man he'd ever met, Anna said. Her voice was thick. He said you were the kind of person who never did anything halfway. He said if he was ever in trouble, you were the person he wanted flying toward him. A pause. He didn't blame you, I need you to know that. My mom kept his letters, the ones he wrote during deployments. He never blamed you for anything. The parking lot was very quiet. I blamed me enough for both of us, Ethan said. I know, she said. I figured. A breath. Can we meet? I'm in Portland. My mom and I moved here 2 years ago. I'll be in Portland this afternoon, Ethan said. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and was somehow both the sound of a 20-year-old who had been holding something for a very long time and felt it move finally in a direction she hadn't been sure it would go. Okay, she said. Anna, Ethan said. Yeah. He knew, Ethan said. Whatever else happened, whatever I didn't do in those 30 seconds, he knew every day that the person flying toward him would come all the way. He knew that about me. And he was right. I always came all the way. He stopped. I was 30 seconds late one time, and I need you to know that I have never for one day pretended that didn't matter. She was quiet for a long time. I know, she said finally. That's actually why I wanted to find you. Another pause. A man who has carried something that heavy for that long, that's someone who loved my dad. And I wanted to meet the person who loved my dad that much. Ethan pressed his free hand flat against the car door. He held it there. I'll see you this afternoon, he said. He drove to Seattle first. Not because the chapter meeting was still happening, it had been rescheduled the way things get rescheduled when one of your members becomes a national news story, but because Tommy had called at 9:30 and asked him to come in, and when Tommy asked you to come in, you came in because in 11 years that request had only ever meant something that mattered. The Seattle clubhouse was everything it always was and had always been loud in certain ways and quiet in others. full of people who had found each other through paths that didn't look like paths until you were past them. Ethan had first walked through that door with nothing in his hands and nothing in his eyes that could have been called hope, and Tommy had handed him a beer and said, "You're home," and the word home had hit him somewhere he hadn't expected because he hadn't realized until that moment that he'd been looking for it. He still felt it when he walked in. He felt it differently now, maybe, more consciously, the way you feel a thing differently when you have been away long enough to lose the habit of taking it for granted. Tommy was in the back, big Tommy, 6'3", and broad as a doorway, with a face that looked like it had been carved from something that doesn't yield easily, and eyes that had always seen more than they let on. He was sitting at a table with two other senior members and a spread of coffee cups in the particular atmosphere of men who have been talking about something serious and are letting it breathe before continuing. He looked up when Ethan came in. He stood up. He crossed the room and he put his hands on Ethan's shoulders, both of them solid and firm, and he looked at him for a moment with the specific expression of a man who has known another man long enough to see past the surface to the thing underneath. "You look different," Tommy said. "Good different or bad different?" "Just different." Tommy released him. "Like something moved." "Something did," Ethan said. Tommy nodded like that was entirely sufficient and turned and said to the room at large, "He's here," and the room responded the way the room always responded when a brother came home with the uncomplicated warmth of people who genuinely do not care where you've been or how you got there, only that you've arrived. Decker was there. He was in the corner talking to an older member holding his coffee with two hands, and he looked up and caught Ethan's eye and gave him a nod that said everything that needed to be said about the previous night without saying any of it. Ethan nodded back. Tommy pulled him aside. "News is all over it," Tommy said. "The plane, the sabotage investigation, the Tacoma bust, they haven't connected all the dots publicly yet, but they're getting there. Your name is in it." "I know. There are 3 media requests at my front desk," Tommy said. "I told them all the same thing, which was that you weren't available and that if they showed up in person, I'd be personally disappointed in their judgment." He said it with the flat certainty of a man who was aware that personal disappointment from him was not a consequence anyone was eager to experience. "But Ethan, this is going to get bigger before it gets smaller. The airline, the investigation, the intelligence operation that apparently was running through your flight, people are going to want to talk to you." "Let them talk," Ethan said. "I'll say what I say, and they'll write what they write, and that's how that works." Tommy looked at him. "You're not worried about it?" "I've got other things to be worried about," Ethan said. "Like what?" "Like a pilot certification I let lapse." He met Tommy's eyes. "I'm going to get it back." Tommy was quiet for a moment. He looked at Ethan at the face the vest, the man he had known for 11 years, in the particular way that comes from proximity and loyalty and shared weather. "You're going to fly again," Tommy said. "I'm going to fly again," Ethan said. Tommy was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "You're still my brother." "I know," Ethan said. "The patch doesn't come off because you got your wings back." "It never crossed my mind." Tommy nodded once, the nod of a man settling something into its correct position. "Good." He picked up his coffee. "Then drink your coffee and tell me what the hell actually happened yesterday, because the news version makes it sound like an action movie, and I know you better than that." Ethan sat down. He told it. He drove back to Portland in the early afternoon. The sky was clear now, completely clear, the kind of sky that looks like it's making a point about itself. And he drove with the window down and the October air coming through cold and clean, and he thought about Ryan and Anna and what it meant to meet the daughter of the person you'd been grieving for 11 years. He thought about what she had said, "I wanted to meet the person who loved my dad that much." He had never thought about it in those terms. Grief as evidence of love rather than evidence of failure. 11 years of carrying something as proof of how much the thing mattered, not proof that he was disqualified from the sky and from his own life. The thought was new enough that he couldn't fully hold it yet, but he could feel it settling the way things settle when they are true. Anna Cooper was waiting at a coffee shop near the waterfront. She was 20 years old and she looked like Ryan in specific ways that Ethan had not fully prepared himself for the jaw. The way she sat forward, the quality of attention in her eyes. She had her father's chess player steadiness. She had something in the set of her expression that said she had already run through multiple versions of this moment and was ready for whatever version actually arrived. She stood when she saw him. She looked at the vest. She looked at his face. She said, "You look like someone who's been awake for 30 hours. About that, he said. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She looked at him across the table for a long moment, a real look, the kind that doesn't pretend to be anything casual. And then she said, "My dad had a photograph in his quarters when he was deployed. Group photo from a training exercise about 15 years ago. You're in the back left. He drew an arrow pointing at you." She paused. "He wrote next to it, 'The most stubborn man alive. Also the best.'" Ethan looked at the table. "He said that he wrote it," she said. "I have the photograph. I brought it." She slid it across the table. It was a printout of an old photograph. The kind of photograph that gets taken at the end of a training exercise when the whole unit is sweaty and tired, and someone produces a camera, and the result is a document of a specific moment in time that only the people in it fully understand. He found himself in it immediately. Back left exactly where she'd said. Younger by 15 years. Still recognizably himself. And beside him, one arm slung across his shoulders with the easy familiarity of someone who has stood beside the same person in enough difficult places that proximity has become its own language. Ryan Cooper. Ethan had not seen Ryan's face in 11 years. Not a photograph, not a video, nothing. He had kept the absence deliberate. I was not prepared for how familiar it was, how immediately and completely he recognized it. The specific angle of Ryan's grin, the one that meant he was in the middle of a joke he hadn't delivered yet. The quality of his posture beside Ethan's. The arrow in the handwriting that he also knew, because 15 years of working alongside a person means you know their handwriting the way you know the sound of their voice. He put his finger on Ryan's face. He kept it there for a moment. Then he set the photograph on the table between them. "I was the funniest person in any room he walked into," Ethan said. "And he never tried to be. It was just the way he said things. He had this timing." He paused. "He used to do this thing when we were on a long recovery flight. He'd start telling a story, get 3/4 through it, and then act like he'd forgotten the ending. And you'd be furious because the setup was so good. Then 20 minutes later, completely out of nowhere, he'd finish the story, like he'd been deciding whether the ending was worth it." Anna was smiling. It was the smile of someone hearing something they'd been waiting to hear confirmed. "He did that at home too," she said. "My mom used to threaten him." "Did it work?" "Never," she said. Ethan looked at her. She was 20 years old and she was Ryan's daughter, and she was not angry, and she had looked for him for 3 years, and she had said she wanted to know who her father was, and Ethan understood sitting here that what she actually meant was, "I want to know him through the eyes of someone who saw all of him. Not just the father version, the whole person." He could give her that. He had 11 years of accumulated things he had never been able to say to anyone. "Tell me what you want to know," he said. She leaned forward, and he told her. They sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He told her about the first day of their training cycle, when Ryan had arrived 20 minutes late and offered an explanation so elaborate and detailed that the instructor had let it go purely out of professional respect for the craft of it. He told her about the mission in the mountains, where they had been pinned for 6 hours waiting for extraction, and Ryan had spent 4 of those hours teaching Ethan a card game he had apparently made up on the spot. He told her about Ryan's ability to read a situation, the water analogy, the 30 seconds ahead vision, and how many times that ability had kept them both alive when the manual wasn't enough. He told her about the last mission. He told it straight, no softening. She deserved the whole truth, and she was old enough to hold it, and she had, in the quality of her attention, already demonstrated that she could. She listened the way Ryan used to listen, completely, without interrupting, with her eyes on him the whole time. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He wrote about that mission. Not in detail, he couldn't, it was classified, but he wrote about the before and after. He wrote a letter to my mom dated 2 days before." She paused. "He said, whatever happens on this one, I need you to know that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing with exactly the right person beside me." He said he never doubted that. Ethan breathed. "He never doubted you," she said. "I need you to have that." The coffee shop was full of the ordinary sounds of the middle of the afternoon, conversations, the espresso machine, the door opening and closing, the world moving through its regular business, and in the middle of all of it, Ethan Walker sat across from Ryan Cooper's daughter and received something that he had not known until this moment that he had been waiting 11 years to receive. Not absolution. He understood now that absolution wasn't the thing he had actually needed, even when he'd thought it was. Witness, someone who knew Ryan, who loved Ryan, who could look at what happened and say he was exactly where he was supposed to be with exactly the right person beside him, and he never doubted it. That was different. That was, in fact, everything. The NTSB published its preliminary findings 6 weeks later. The deliberate sabotage of Flight 7228 was confirmed. The contamination of Engine 2's fuel supply had been introduced post-fueling by an individual using a cloned maintenance badge. Forensic analysis of the contamination agent confirmed military-grade specificity. The dosage had been calculated to cause progressive engine degradation at altitude without triggering ground-level detection. Victor Kale's organization was identified as the operational source. Marsh, the logistics coordinator, pulled guilty to multiple federal charges and provided extensive testimony that led to 15 additional arrests across 3 states. The Tacoma operation had been interdicted successfully. The component transfer had not completed, the buyer had not received the materials, and the chain that Kale had spent 4 years building was, according to the federal prosecutor's statement, comprehensively dismantled. Sandra Reeves was commended in the classified portion of the debrief. The public version said nothing about her. She preferred it that way. Daniel Brooks returned to the line 8 weeks after the incident. Before his first flight back, he did something he hadn't done before. He walked the full exterior of the aircraft before boarding every panel, every port, every access point. The way a man walks a thing when he finally understands the full weight of what it means to be responsible for it. The ground crew watched him and said nothing. They understood. Captain James Mercer took medical leave for 3 months and came back to flying the following spring. His first flight back, his wife was in seat 1A. She had never liked flying. She got on anyway. When they reached altitude, she took his hand over the armrest between the cockpit jump seat where she had been given special permission to sit, and he covered her hand with his, and they flew together for the first time at 35,000 feet. And neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. Walter Hayes wrote Ethan a letter, an actual letter handwritten on cream-colored paper in the meticulous script of a man who had been taught penmanship in a time when it meant something. It said in its entirety, I told you that you couldn't take out what was in you. I wanted you to know that I've been right about very few things in my life with the certainty I felt about that. Fly safe. Walter. Ethan kept the letter in his vest beside the note from Anna. Diane Kowalski sent a photograph to the airline, who forwarded it to Ethan. It was a photograph of her holding her granddaughter Eva, 6 weeks old, wrinkled and perfect eyes shut against the brightness of the world. And on the back, she had written, "Because of you." We say hello first now. Lily's parents sent a drawing. Crayon on white paper, the way 5-year-olds draw, earnest, confident, magnificently unconcerned with accuracy. An airplane broad and cheerful, a stick figure in the cockpit with what was clearly intended to be a leather vest. And beside the airplane on the ground, a small figure with a rabbit arm raised in the full arm wave that Ethan had seen through the terminal window and had not forgotten and would not forget. He put it on the wall of his apartment. It was the first thing he had put on any wall in 11 years. His recurrency training took 4 months. He did it the way he did everything, completely, without halfway, with the specific thoroughness of a man who had made a decision and intended to honor it. The check rides were rigorous, and he passed them without drama because the 11 years had not eroded what was there, and what was there had always been substantial. His military record spoke for itself. The FAA examiner, a dry-humored woman named Chen, who had seen every kind of pilot and was impressed by very few of them, told him at the end of the final check ride that he was the most instinctively competent recurrent candidate she had assessed in 6 years, and then told him to stay current and not let another 11 years happen. "It won't," he said. She gave him his certification. He held it in his hands for a moment, the physical document, the thing that said officially what had always been true, and he thought about Ryan and about Anna and about the moment in that hospital room when Mercer had said, "The world needs people like you in the sky." He thought about Sayat 5A and the frequency change and the vibration, and the moment he had almost not stood up. He thought about almost. I thought about what Walter Hayes had said. Almost is the most important word in most stories. He put the certification in his vest pocket and walked out into the morning. But 6 months after Flight 728, Ethan Walker flew again for the first time in 11 years. Not commercially, not in a rescue capacity that would come later when the coordination with the military reserve program he had applied to came through. On this day, it was a small single-engine aircraft rented from a flight school outside Portland on a clear November morning when the air was cold and sharp and the kind of transparent that made every edge of the world look cut clean. He ran his pre-flight with the care of a man who had learned not from a manual, but from the specific weight of consequence. That preparation is the only honest form of respect you can pay to what you're about to do. He checked every panel, every control surface, every instrument. He got in, he sat in the left seat. He put his hands on the controls and felt the familiar weight of them. The slight resistance, the living quality of a machine that responds, and he sat for a moment with that before he started the engine. He thought about Ryan. He said his name once quietly in the small cabin with no one to hear it. Then he started the engine. He taxied to the runway. He ran the run-up, checked the magneto, set the trim. He lined up on centerline. He pushed the throttle forward. And Ethan Walker climbed back into the sky. The ground fell away beneath him, the way it always did, the way it had done 1,000 times before, the way that never got ordinary, no matter how many hours you accumulated. The field dropped back. The roads became lines, the city became pattern, and above him the sky opened in every direction simultaneously, the way it only opens from inside it, the way that no description ever fully captures, because the thing itself is larger than the words available. He climbed to 4,000 feet. He leveled off. He flew, not toward anything specific, not on a rescue or a route or a mission, just flew the way a man walks when he has been sitting too long for the motion itself, for the restoration of something that had been still too long and needed to be moving again. I thought about the biker life and the pilot life, and Sandra saying some people are made for more than one thing, and Mercer saying the world needs people like you in the sky, and Tommy saying the patch doesn't come off because you got your wings back. He thought about the leather vest hanging in his apartment, the certification in the drawer beside his bed, the drawing on the wall with the crayon airplane, and the stick figure and the rabbit. He thought about 11 years of road. I thought about one afternoon in seat 5A. He thought about the things you carry and the things you put down and the things you discover when you finally stop running have been with you the entire time, not as burdens, but as the actual shape of who you are. He had not lost himself when Ryan died. He had hidden himself. Those were not the same thing. And now he was here at 4,000 feet in November over Oregon with his hands on the controls of a small airplane and the whole sky in front of him, the same sky that had taken Ryan, the same sky that had held Flight 728 while he brought it home, the same sky that had been waiting with the absolute patience of something that does not experience time the way people do for him to come back. He flew for an hour and 40 minutes. He landed clean. He tied down the aircraft, signed the logbook, and walked to his motorcycle in the parking lot, the Road King black and heavy, and exactly what it had always been. He put on his helmet. He sat on the bike for a moment. Pilot, biker, brother, the man who stood up when everyone expected him to stay down. All of it true, all of it his. He started the engine. He rode. And the man in the leather vest with the Hells Angels patch, and the eagle on his left hand, and the sky in his blood, and the road under his wheels was finally completely and without reservation himself. That is who Ethan Walker was. That is who he had always been. And from the afternoon he unbuckled his seatbelt in row 5